And when is Alyssa going to?
So Alyssa will be kind of rolling in right at 3:45.
Okay.
So that's our friend from the state of Minnesota who's gonna come here and then spend the night too, so.
Okay, we did get the YouTube stream going, so we are
Oh,
live
good.
and
Okay.
broadcasting.
Yay. Saved for posterity.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think probably as long as we're live, we might as well get started. I'm Bill Gabler, I'm Vice Chair of the HRA Board. I'm only doing this because Mary Salmonus, who's the chair, is unavailable. She had a decision, an executive decision to make whether to be here or a long delayed trip to see her grandchildren. And the fact that she's with her grandchildren shows the exact kind of leadership that we named her as chair, because we named her, for which we named her as chair. But and she does send her regrets, but excited to either tune in or watch this later. Really, first of all, special thanks to Minnesota Housing Partnership and to the EDA board and to Beth Drost for sharing the resources under the agreement between those two entities with our HRA. And this session is a good example of that. With A, what we need, and B, what we're getting. Don't always kind of correspond, but it does here. It really is, it's an indication of exactly how community, the whole community is behind the effort here for dealing with our housing issues. The housing issues are many, some are long-standing, like the fact we're sitting on bedrock, and 85% of the county is public land and not available for development, but others are more recent, and it involves employers, employees, government entities, and seniors, and actually then eventually the tourists, because it's gotten to be so significant an issue that it could affect our tourism business, which is literally, other than headstone lumber, it's the only industry I actually know of in Cook County, and it's the driver here. So we're excited, A, to be working on this, and B, to have the kind of resources that Housing Partnership brings, and that Beth and the EDA have already brought to the table. In fact, just getting the HRA created was really their work, and we're very appreciative. I would like to also note the other HRA commissioners. Lawrence Stowe is here with us. Chris O'Brien was going to dial in, and Chris Gildem.
You just walked in.
No, Chris, and Chris is here, and so we've all raised our hands and want to put in the effort to help here. But I'd also like to really welcome, if any of you by now haven't met him, I'd be shocked, but Jason Hale is our executive director. Jason, to use a bad pun, Jason Hale's from the Duluth HRA.
I've heard that one before.
And not just the Duluth HRA, but the city of Duluth. And I've got to be honest, when I looked at his resume, I thought, oh boy, this is, a real powerful candidate. But would he even take the job if we offered it to him? And I literally, that was part of my thinking. And the good news is Jason did, and he was offered the job and he took it. And we're just pleased with his commitment to Cook County at this stage. And our job is to support him in his activities, and the board can take care of some policies, but Jason is where the really should be there in terms of resources we get and how we apply them. So thanks to Jason for being here. Jason, I'll turn it over to you. Anything you'd like to say?
Actually, sure. I might switch over to Beth quick if that's okay.
That's fine.
Beth, do you have anything you want to share on behalf of the EDA who brought us here?
Well, gosh, I feel like just nothing, because I didn't do any of it. I didn't go to the meetings and the public hearings and all of that. And I think that we owe a big thank you to the end people, the county commissioners, who kind of in the end said, yeah, let's do this. But is Mary on the phone? Did she come in?
She's watching on YouTube.
She's watching.
From some cameras, I
Okay.
don't know which cameras.
I think I'm off camera, but hi, Mary.
Mhm.
You know, I went through all of the minutes up until this point about the HRA and looked in on who this Jason Hale guy was, because he was here one time, through that work group for the home bill. You were involved in that, and a whole bunch of people were involved in the housing work group, which is still going on. It's kind of a subset of the HRA now. And so, just bringing everything together, and finally, with the creation of the HRA and having Minnesota Housing Partnership here to kind of help us with the handover, so to speak, even though there's nothing really to hand over. Maybe some keys in the coming months to new homeowners. But anyway, just big thank you to you guys and the work that the Minnesota Housing Partnership has helped us with. And it's not just the ARA. I've had half a dozen questions that I've just kind of shot your way, and then you bounce me to someone else, and I love that. Like, I can't do that, but I know who to talk to. So really, it's been great working with you. So yeah, I mean, here I am in this job for like 8 months now, and they say housing is supposed to not be on my plate, and so officially it's not going to be on my plate, and I'm really excited about that, because it means that, you know, you're going to get, our citizens are going to get way better service from us, because one person is a lot to do everything, and we're not that big yet. So I look forward to growing this new organization with Jason and with the board members and with the support of the county and our board as well. So kind of kicks us off here and tells us what we can learn here, how we can work together, what the future beholds, and it is what we make it. So let's make it a positive thing.
I'd make one last recognition as well as we're doing that. And, at our last HRA board meeting, we passed a resolution thanking James Dorkey for the work he had done to get us to this point. Here he is, our technical assistant now, making sure that the internet's connected and that the PowerPoint works. But James was the key help too in getting us to where we are. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Are folks comfortable while we're like presenters? Are you okay if we pick our masks up or speaking to everybody? Is that okay?
Whatever you're comfortable doing.
Yeah, I'm fine with it. It's just long. I mean, it's as fun as it is to speak through a mask long term. It's a little tricky. So I'll keep it short because we've already had two fine folks cover most everything. I'll just say that this is day 8. Yeah, and it's been really fun so far. It's a privilege. The folks that I've met in Cook County are great. They really have been great. It's been really welcoming. I had a great meeting this morning with Minnesota Housing Partnership folks. There's a lot of energy and interest in this topic. And so now it's kind of the best and worst time to be in housing because there's enough people that are rowing in the right direction and understand the need, and it's also one of the most challenging times to build housing. I have a lot of faith in the Cook County community to band together and do what we need to do to get creative. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that. So far that has proven out. I know it's only day 8, but I don't think that will change. So thanks for your trust in me in this role, and I'm really excited. And there's lots to learn, and so today is really about learning. And so I guess with that, I'll just transition over to Minnesota Housing Partnership is going to talk. As the agenda says, just about what HRAs can do and can't do, and then we have a whole bunch of fun stuff. And one thing that I'll mention just quick is that we might, and I don't know if you were going to speak to this, so sorry Elizabeth, if you were, we might not get to everything depending on how robust the conversations are. As we were talking about this morning, one of our priorities here is really to get our brains going and to engage this smaller group to think about opportunities, assets, ways to get there, priorities. And if that's happening and there's really good conversation, that's better than making sure we check all of the boxes. So we want to prioritize that. While we also have to respect Jeff Corey's time, because he's joining in the call, and of course Alyssa from Minnesota Housing Finance is going to be here. So just as that as a caveat, if there's some really productive conversation happening, we want to make sure that we get to as much of that as we can.
I was wondering if maybe Carol wants to introduce herself first, just so we can do some introductions, and then I'm kicking off the first part of our program.
Hi, I'm new to the team. My name is Carol Burr. I've been working with Minnesota Housing Partnership since June of last year, not quite a year. I'm a community development manager for MHP, and so I work with different beneficiaries. Currently, I'm doing the Native Community Development Institute. I'm coordinating that, and we're working with some tribes in South Dakota and one in Nebraska. And we're doing actual workshops, so we, like 4 of them we're going to be doing. My background is I'm trying to be quick here, the housing director for my tribe for 13 plus years, and during my tenure there, I built 70 plus homes. One of them was a 20-unit permanent supportive housing project, 2 tax credits. I just came in on the finishing of the second one, and then I just did a new one before I left. We did a lot of building with like the ARPA monies we had back then that HUD had gotten back in, 2009, 2008, I can't remember. I'm old, so my memory's not that great. So. But that's my background, and I love building. I love helping people create their projects, so happy to be here.
So hello everybody, my name is Elizabeth Glidden. I know some of you have met me before in person, and for some this is the first time in person, and then virtually attending some of your meetings, but I'm the Deputy Executive Director at Minnesota Housing Partnership. I have a little different career path than Carol. I was an employment lawyer for a bit, did some work in local government for a bit, and then for the past 4+ years I've been at Minnesota Housing Partnership, working in a combination of areas including policy and advocacy work, and also giving direct technical assistance to a variety of communities. Like Jason said, this is really about starting to get our brains going together and creating that foundation together. So some of this material may feel like you've seen it a little bit before. We hope we ask some different questions so that you're thinking about it in a little bit different way. And we will get as far as we get today. If you want to move this forward, thanks. So just a grounding again in why Minnesota Housing Partnership is here. I know the HRA board has talked about this a few different times, but we are here because there was an application for a grant program that we administer called Strengthening Rural Communities that came from the EDA. And that started the process where, as part of one of these assignments, we worked to construct a Memorandum of Understanding, and that guides the work areas that we work in. And there's been some tweaks to this Memorandum of Understanding. One of the items that was on there that's now checked off was creation of an HRA. Mm-hmm. So we now have 2 areas that are very broad, really. One is to support the organizational development of the HRA, and then also to identify tools, policies, and programs. So that really gives us a lot of latitude in how we're able to support the work here. Continue on. So HRAs in Minnesota, these are the predominant ways that in Minnesota housing programs are delivered. So there's a lot of HRAs all over, over 230. I think what's interesting is how unique each of them is. And we'll talk about that a little bit, even though power is all derived from the same authorities. Yet each of these are created to really serve, again, the needs of the community within which it sits. Next slide. As a lawyer, I always kind of go back to the statutory language, but I think it's helpful just as we kind of think about what is the purpose of the HRA, because it's a different purpose than the EDA has or other organizations. So here, right from the statutory language, we see that the purpose is to provide adequate, safe, and sanitary housing, redevelop blighted areas, work on some planning activities, and then in the end, we are remedying the shortage of housing for low and moderate income residents. And also looking at examples where private enterprise, so the private market isn't going to just do the job on its own. This is a slide that you may have seen before. I know that you've looked at these authorities and powers before. So what I would say is that, you know, as you look at these authorities, and this is sort of a shortcut explanation of a much longer language list in the actual statute, but the HRA has really very significant power. These are powerful entities. They have a very broad range of authority. And again, going back to this, every entity is unique. You really kind of look to the origin story of each HRA to understand a little bit more why is it focusing in a way that it is focusing. Many HRAs were created to create and manage and operate public housing. So that is not the case here, but that was the case for many of the HRAs throughout the state and the time period in which many were created within the state. Others have been created for other, maybe even more particular purposes. I've heard of HRAs that were created because there was a desire to utilize the powers of the HRA to build a public building, as an example. And then we have other HRAs that either are being created or now are expanding their authorities to walk more into the development world. And that is more the space that this HRA, or the conversation that's been happening within which, you know, this HRA was created. There's some other powers that aren't on that list back there. You don't have to go back. So I just, you know, it's sort of a laundry list, but things like contracting, things like leasing, all of these powers really can be powerful depending on how you utilize them and for what purpose. So as we kind of continue on, I think one thing I want to emphasize is that a lot of the power of the HRA is not necessarily encompassed in that statutory language. It's a bit of how do you create the power that you need and how do you maintain that power. And so these are some of the, I think, typical ways that you might think about how do you build that capital that is not just the resource capital or the financial capital. And so how you go about your work, how you take advantage of these opportunities will really help identify what are the ways in which you will utilize that power to achieve your goals. Just take a market opportunity as an example. You know, as the HRA, you are uniquely poised to identify how do you combine understanding of market opportunity with building the political will, or identifying the right tools that then match up to allow you to achieve your goals. Yeah. Wanted to touch on this relationship between the HRA and local government. And again, I know you're familiar with this relationship because local government created the HRA, right? But there's a couple of additional things I just wanted you to think about that sometimes are commonly talked about when you think about that relationship between the HRA and local government. And I think of it myself in terms of how these entities are separate and also how they're very connected. So the issue around the separation that sometimes is discussed as an opportunity, depends on how you look at it, is that, again, the HRA is an independent entity. So you don't go to the city or to the county for permission for each activity that you may undertake. I've heard some folks in different communities say that that is helpful as they look at how to divide the work that, you know, ends up building the support for projects and plans. Because there is some separation between local government and the entity like the HRA. The HRA is doing that bottom-up work to vet these projects, sometimes to take the hard hits in trying to understand, you know, where is the need and how does that match up against sort of the community will and the political will. And sometimes that can be helpful for there to be some separation in how these decisions kind of make their way through an HRA structure and then up to public elected bodies. Another thing, just way to think about it though, is about the strong connection between these public bodies and the HRA. So while there are formal ways that we know the HRA touches these public bodies, such as certain approvals or consent that must be given, really that relationship goes much deeper. I gave some examples here of certain tools that are not within the purview of the HRA, and yet these can be important tools, and there's others on that list too, to accomplishing the work and the goals of housing in the community. So again, you can kind of see, you know, even though there's different decisions that are made at different places, the ability for there to be good connection, good relationship between these bodies will be really essential to how you get your work done together, and that there's agreement in the end on some shared purpose, and then what are the tools that make sense in this particular community to explore and put into place. And I'll just say too, you know, I hope folks ask questions. I should have said this before. So if there's any, you know, I don't mean to just keep talking this, and also this is not like the Word of God here. So this is really, these are some thoughts, some perspectives, but you may have different ways you think about it. And would love that to be part of our conversation here. I know folks are watching online, but also we're a small group in here, where hopefully that can be kind of our flow. Yes?
I just would note one thing that she didn't mention as she introduced herself. The reason she's so well versed on difference between legal authority and political will and using both all sorts of entities to create that is that she was a Minneapolis City Council member. And
It's
that
not so popular to mention all
but she understands what that process is all about. And you know, somebody takes hits and other people run for cover and other, you know, but it's a process, and she's been involved in it, and I think she speaks with authority there.
Any other questions that have been hitting you as we're going through the material? Otherwise, we'll just kind of keep marching on. All right. So here, this is, I think you've seen some versions of this list of funding and financing tools. And in some ways, this is the list that gets people really excited, you know, how can I really understand these tools? What can they be used for? And I will say, like, each one of these you can do like a big seminar on, you know, and so that's why we kind of try to talk about them at the high level instead of kind of getting into the weeds. Because some of these may be tools you use, some of these may not be tools you use. Because you have an authority does not mean you have to use it. But you should understand what are typical tools, what are powers and authorities, and what is frequently used by some of your peer organizations. I would say the first three that I put at the top there, I just want to have a little extra emphasis on those. You've already used your levy authority. This is one of the most commonly used authorities, and it's also one of the few authorities that really has that regularity right? So you can use it to pay your ongoing operations, or you use it to pay salary and things like that. It's reliable. Issuing bonds, this is another very commonly utilized authority. Just to point that out. Establishing tax increment districts. I know you've kind of had this conversation already, or sort of been working in the tax abatement sphere. Tax increment districts, another kind of version of how you think about that taxing authority and how can that be utilized to support a public purpose in a project. And you should know that, as the years have been going on and we kind of see the state as a whole, with Cook County being one part of that, across the state we see constrained supply, which means it's more and more difficult to think about what needs to be done to move a project forward, and then what are those projects that are deserving of some additional public support, and what are the appropriate ways that local government then is part of that process. So this will be kind of part of that ongoing conversation, also that ongoing conversation between the HRA and the county, and of course the city. Let me see, is there anything else I want to mention on that one?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes,
On the
sir.
funding?
Mm-hmm.
The HRAs that you're familiar with, do they, how many of them are operating with their own funds, either taxes or grants or grant writing, or are operating sort of administratively with other people's financial? How many HRAs are self-funded? I guess is my question.
Well, I mean, I'm not, you might want to say a little bit more about what you mean by self-funded.
If the HRA wants to build houses,
Yes.
are they self-funded? Or are they sort of administrating with contractors and banks and putting all those pieces together with having a very limited budget of the HRA's budget itself is very limited?
Yeah. So we might think about programs and operations separately from projects. But I would say just as a big picture, it would be a very unusual HRA that funded only with, for example, one source like your levy. So you are going, again, that levy is going to be often a kind of a baseline, and then you have a whole variety of, how HRAs, whether they support a one staff person or a part of a staff person or things like that. But then how do they do the work? Sometimes that may be with some levy money or some other one-time source, like what are some of the examples on this list. But usually you are sourcing other types of funds, particularly to fund your projects and your programs. So an example may be a lot of smaller communities apply for the small city deed program, and that helps them with funds with which they can operate certain programs. And that's sort of a pass-through. Other funds aren't necessarily just pass-through, but can be sometimes cobbled together to make it work. I don't know if that is answering your question, but it's unusual maybe just to say that you are going to just have, again, like your levy or something like that, that is the source of your ability to operate all the programs or projects that you need.
And Lawrence, Carol and I are going to be going over a couple of case studies, and I think we'll actually
Okay,
address
good. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Good.
Yes, yeah, that's part of kind of what we're bringing, some examples. One item that I just want to mention that's new on this list that we've worked on quite a bit is at MHP is local housing trust funds. This is another example where it's not the HRA that makes the decision about forming a local housing trust fund. It is a government-funded, and the government makes the decision to establish a local housing trust fund. It can be funded many different kinds of ways, but it is common for that fund to be administered by an HRA. So another example. Let's move it forward. So the slide just before that on risk, I just wanted to touch quickly. This issue about risk is a really big one. And I think sometimes it can be very new to HRAs to think about how do they participate in sharing risk and what that can mean to support a project. So I just want to put that in your brain, that sharing risk doesn't happen all the time by entities, and doing that is a major decision, but that also can be very important to helping projects move forward. That was an example from Otterdale. Next slide. So this is just a list of some questions to kind of roll around, because again, going back to that resource list, not all of those resources may necessarily be appropriate to this community. Not all of these resources may fit a particular project's needs. And there's assessment that needs to happen to determine, you know, is the HRA wanting to move forward with a certain tool or not, or what the broader community and the local government entities think about that. So another just thing that often comes up as we were talking about the cash that's needed as opposed to financing tools is often as you're thinking about projects, there's a point in time where you just need some money. That's in that pre-development phase. Often there can be you know, a critical way to jumpstart a project, but often it's also hard to identify how to acquire some funds for those soft upfront costs. I'm just going to move through this. This is just, again, it's hard work you're doing. And that's just acknowledging this. I think the biggest thing I would just say again is about these are long-term projects. You know that, but it bears repeating because there can be a real desire for those quick results. And I think you have to kind of phase up your projects to be able to identify how can we identify and celebrate those wins along the way. Another just reminder that housing isn't just one type. Really, a housing market is going to have a number of different types of housing. How much goes in different categories, that's, you know, again, more community specific. But a healthy housing market, you need to be thinking about a variety of these types. You can move forward.
Didn't I?
One more.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I know that there are these continuing questions about the difference between the EDA and the HRA. In some ways, sometimes those questions are a little difficult to answer because an EDA, how it's created is that it can have the powers of an HRA. It can take on the powers of multiple different, the Port Authority too. And so it can, in theory, if it's the decision is made to grant all those authorities together, it can have that breadth of activity. I think there's some slight differences in how the levy works. I don't know if how important that is to you. One is, you know, really the local government kind of does the levy for the EDA versus the HRA, that's a consent resolution from local government to do that. HRA is not subject if there's any debt limits, which sometimes in Minnesota that comes up and down, whether the legislature in its wisdom says there has to be limits on levies or whatever. But it's really these things below that about what's the scope within which you're working. And so, you know, as Beth was describing in her opening comments, you know, the EDA has a very broad scope of work. And if you add all the powers of an HRA to that, that broadens that scope of work even more. So as you know, an EDA, through its normal activities, can do some housing activities. And again, you could add to those powers. But then by doing so, you have this broad focus. And whereas the HRA has a focus that is about housing. It's, you know, kind of very simplistic, but yet it really matters. It matters in, as you think about what are those activities of the operations and how they play out. And so really that's kind of going through, you know, if it's hard to figure out what financial tools make sense, even harder if you're an EDA with this broad breadth of activity, to figure out how do we keep enough focus on these long-term housing projects to make sure that we are achieving our goals. So I'm going to turn it over to Carol and Jason, because now we're going to kind of dive into some case studies, so you can see a little bit more some examples of housing projects that make this theory more fun.
Yeah. So I'm going to discuss the permanent supportive housing homeless project, kind of how to develop that. Why develop homeless housing? Homeless housing is a means to ending homelessness for families and individuals struggling with addiction, mental health, and/or disabilities, and who can benefit from subsidized housing with supportive services. Real key factor if you're considering doing any kind of homeless housing is make sure you have your service providers on board when you start planning and when you start the development process, because if you don't have them on board, it's not going to be a successful project. Housing that is permanent. So if you have someone with addictions or mental health issues, normally in public housing, they are evicted for using or having like breakdowns and stuff. With this type of project, they're more than likely not going to be evicted. There's a little more leeway. You have your service providers that are working, you know, with them to ensure that they stay in their housing. It's also affordable. Your rents are low and affordable, like 30% of their income, and it can be set off with subsidies. And there's a variety of them that you can probably get access to. There's the housing choice vouchers, HUD Continuum of Care, that's a permanent supportive housing voucher. There's the Housing Trust Fund and HUD BASH if they are veterans. Those are just some examples. There's tons of them out there. And your housing is safe. That means that your tenants are going to feel confident, and you're going to be able to probably take on those support services and get their help, the help that they need, making them more of a productive individual or tenant. So very successful if you include all that. Who is homeless? So homeless isn't just people who live on the street or under bridges. You know, it can be also it can be overcrowded conditions, couch surfing. So say I have a house and I've got like 5, 10 other extra people living with me because I have nowhere else to live. They would be considered legally and technically by the state of Minnesota as homeless because they don't have their own place. Recently discharged individuals from prison really struggle with housing. It's an issue. Living in places not normally housing, like your cars, garages, abandoned buildings, different areas like that. And the first, so I'm going to talk about how to develop it. So your first thing you want to do is access your community and do a study. Find out how many people are homeless in your community, how many units you think you're going to have to need, and then make sure that you have those support services that are available. Like I said, support services is crucial in making this a successful project. Yeah, thanks.
Carol, can you say a little bit about, I mean, homeless people don't always want to be identified as such.
Correct.
And they can be really hard to find. So do you have any advice about how to accomplish that?
That, if you're going to be doing like a community needs assessment, just making sure that when you're interviewing your community that they're honest about them having other members, not their immediate family, living with them. I know it's really hard because I come from a reservation, and when we built ours, it was, our community was like, we don't need a homeless shelter, or homeless housing project because they're living with me. And it's like, well, you know, they're living with you because they don't have anywhere to live. Those are the hardest ones to identify, but when you do the study, definitely make sure that you want them to be open and honest about it because you're trying to help them, you know, because they're supporting, you know, 1 or 2 families in their household. So I would push for that. But I can do some research too and send it to you if you want it.
Okay.
Definitely, any questions? If I can't answer it, I can get you information.
How do you get around the or should you get around the cultural issues? Like the Hmong community in St. Paul, they have very large extended families living in a single place. That by Western standards, there's too many people and not enough bedrooms, not enough bathrooms, so on and so forth. And yet, that family system is intact. So how do you get around that? Or do you get around that?
I'm not sure how they didn't do that. I would think it would be more of an education issue, you know, and respecting their culture, because you want to make sure you're doing that, but also an education part of it where you can explain to them, you know, you could be more comfortable in your own unit, you know, that it's not that expensive, you know, because a lot of people, when they're overcrowded, it's because they can't afford it.
Okay, thank you.
So you want to figure out the feasibility of it. So once you find out you need the homeless development, you need to find out if you're going to be able to afford it. So you would figure out the cost, figure out who's going to be served, because you can pick, I mean, it can be, a homeless development can be open to everyone, or it can be like focused for homeless youth. So there's different types of projects you can do. Just depends on your community and what your assessment study came up with. Cost to operate it, you know, you want to make sure that once you build it, you're going to be able to maintain it, you know, do the repairs that you need to do, any offset costs. You want to evaluate the practicality of your project to decide if you will be able to move forward. Definitely you need to do that because you actually need to do that in any project. So you can use this slide show PowerPoint to kind of use it to develop any kind of project because you need all that information prior. So another thing to be successful at creating and developing a permanent supportive housing project is the development. You need a team of experienced development individuals, supportive services, and property management. And your HRA could actually be your property management as long as they understand the rules and the eligibility criteria and how to do the reporting because your funding source is going to determine that. And a lot of homeless developments will hire a property manager, and that's a costly factor. Unless you have the money to do it, your HRA can do it too. So the owner is your is the legally responsible entity that manages the project. Your developer provides the construction and completing it and making it ready for occupancy. Your property manager can either be your HRA or you hire a company, and they're kind of hard to find and they're kind of hard to keep, in my experience. So Boy Sports, New Moon, I think are on their 3rd property manager, and that happens on and off the res, so I'm not sure they're hard to find. And then your service provider, and that can be like counselors, mental health counselors, clinics, hospitals. Next. So this is what what we did up in Boy Sport, and it's a combination of apartments and 3 and 2 bedroom duplexes. We also incorporated the community space. There's a kitchen area, and I want to say that space is almost as big as the room we're sitting in now, and it had a full kitchen and fridge, and So your tenants can come in there and have meetings, they can get, learn how to do crafts, you know, do community stuff to make them feel like a healthy product in your environment. They also had offices, so if you did have a property management company, they would have an office. Your services people could sit in there, like we have, when I left, there was, I want to say CD manager and mental health counselor that sat in those, two of those offices, and they were there all the time. And then a small meeting room, because you want your tenants to have someplace safe to go and meet, like one-on-one if they have to. Say they're on parole or something and they want to meet in a secure, safe spot. And this I'm going to show, the next one I'm going to show you, the project was $4 million plus. And these are all of the different funders we had to go through to actually accomplish building that. And along with that, each of those funders had their own requirements as far as reporting and eligibility and stuff. But it's not, I mean, it's not that hard. I mean, it looks tough.
Thanks, I needed to hear that.
Because even tax credit, which I believe, Jason is gonna go over some of the tax credit. They look complicated and they look scary, but they're really not. And if you have somebody who understands that, which Jason totally understands all that, the reporting and stuff is fairly simple. And managing and understanding what, you know, who can be in your units and who can't be, because, you know, there's, some of them are real strict. So this is a picture of the outside. We also included like a playground area, basketball court, and then spots for them to do like a barbecue, so that they feel it's so they feel normal. I shouldn't say that. That's rude, but you know what I mean. So they feel like they belong to the community.
Yeah. What are the ages of occupancy in there? Are there children involved?
These were the duplexes were just like for families with children, and then they had to be 18 or older to actually occupy the one bedrooms. And we didn't like, you know, you have to be careful because you want to make sure that the children aren't hanging out in that one bedroom apartment complex, which was where the yellow building that was just on there. Because they're drinking, you know, they're not going to quit overnight,
right.
So they're going to still continue to have their vices, but they're working towards quitting. And these are our duplexes. So we worked it out too where they weren't, when your parking wasn't like right next to each other, trying to give them a little bit of individuality. So, and then it was just an article that was in our Voice for It News, and those are, you can access that online, or Voice for It News. Sorry, I went through that kind of quick because we're running out of time, but definitely if you have questions, you can email them to me and I can send you more information. And I did bring some, I didn't bring enough for everybody, but I'll leave these with Jason, but it's like different information on the Housing Trust Fund, subsidies that you can get, the BASH, which is for your veterans. So I'll leave that, and I'm sure Jason already knows it, but I printed some out for you guys.
Thank you. I picked a chartreuse color just to wake people up in case you're line drives. Is it okay if I stand over here? Because it looks like Great. Thank you. There's going to be a little bit of, not overlap, but we talked a little bit about our permanent support housing project too. You can go to the first slide if you don't mind. I'm going to also try to be quick, so if I'm talking fast, it's because I respect the clock. So we have time for Q&A. I'm focusing, there's a lot of things we could talk about, and just a quick aside from what Carol said, I've actually been talking with Allison, Public Health and Human Services of the county, Allison McIntyre and Allison Plummer, about how we're tracking folks who are experiencing homelessness, how we don't have a good way of doing that, in part because there's no shelter system in Cook County, which means we don't have the same people going to the shelter systems to get counted and so on. But I do have numbers every year, and they're coming out with 2022. We're working on that now. So I'm tracking that and trying to figure out, because the reason I'm mentioning this is because to build a project like the one that she was mentioning, or one that I'm going to go through, you really have to have, of course, the need. You have the demand for it. And when you scale it down too small, it becomes almost untenable. I mean, think about doing all those funding sources for 4 units. It just becomes a question of, are there other ways we can crack the nut here aside from doing a LIHTC project or something? So definitely still, that is on my radar for sure, and trying to work with public health and your colleagues and figure out, okay, how do we do a better job of tracking this, or is there a way we can get our arms on more data? Having said that, there are really 2 ways in which we can make projects happen, and that is to help other people who are going to do them, or want to do them, or do them ourselves as HRA. I'm going to caveat all of this, and kind of generally for the day, in saying HRAs can do a lot, but bandwidth and capacity are really important. I'll say I'm somewhat confident that I can get a lot done. I also know my limits, and as one person, being a property manager and the admin and legal. So there's a point at which it becomes, okay, what's the best way to outsource some of these things and get them paid for, or have people do them as technical assistants, or find funding to get the other people to do it, so that we don't have to try to be a property manager and a public housing manager, all those things. Because yes, for a lot of reasons. So, having said that, we can go to the next one. Thanks, James. There are 2 examples I'm going to give. They're kind of on different ends of the spectrum as far as what an HRA can do. These are 2 projects that I worked really closely on in the loop before I left. This was just funded this last year. Skyward Flats is part of a Harbor Highlands redevelopment. It's a neighborhood that is explicitly redeveloped since 2005, I think, for affordable housing. So most 90% of the units are affordable housing units. And by the way, when I guess in this space, when we're talking about affordable, like it's a capital A, and of course that's a question that comes up all the time. Like, what does affordable mean? So with our HRA hats on, it really means anything that's 80% of the area median income or less. That's most funding sources. That's what they consider. And when you talk about like more deeply affordable, like a tax credit project, it's 60% of the area median income or less. That's really the thresholds. And then Carol was talking about the 30% benchmark. That's permanent supportive housing. That's a kind of a separate deal that says there's so much subsidy required for those projects that it's the tenant. If the tenant makes $100 a month, 30% of that goes to rent, whatever they make. So for obvious reasons, on the front end of permanent supportive housing like this, and like the one New Moon, that takes a significant amount of funding on the front end because there's no revenue on the back end. So whoever's operating and managing it, there's no big cash piles to be made in permanent supportive housing. So it's really important to get like to Carol's point, the supportive staff, the service providers on front, like early before you even start contemplating the project, and they are increasingly difficult to find. For this project, we talked to multiple, and this is a 70-unit project, so it's not like, it's not worth their time. It is, but finding people with the staff capacity to do it, I mean, when you're considering people that are in that industry aren't making a ton of money, and the job market is where it is now, they're pulling from the same pool of people to try to get them to staff the agency. So finding people to staff it is very difficult, and I don't know of any in Cook County. I don't know of any permanent supportive housing projects, but I haven't. You could prove me wrong.
No.
None. Okay. And there are reasons for that. Size, cost, staffing, all of those things. I mean, it's difficult enough to build market rate housing right now. So when you think about the complexities of this, part of the reason. Okay, so these are the 2 I'm going to talk about. The LIHTC project, that's the fancy way of saying low-income housing tax credit project, because that becomes cumbersome, so we just say LIHTC. And then the cottage village project that I designed, that's under construction now, next week. So we'll go to the next one. The reason I put this up here is just to give you an idea. This is actually a snapshot from the HRA's Minnesota Housing Finance application. And it's an $18.6 million project. So, I mean, they did the math for you. Sorry, it's really tiny here. It's almost $270,000 per unit, and these are all 1-bedroom units. They don't have the dog spa or the cedar plank saunas. So this isn't an extremely fancy arrangement, but it's worth mentioning because this is the construction environment we're dealing with. And there's some inflation these types of projects can be a little inflated because of how Minnesota Housing scores things, and I won't get into the weeds on scoring because I don't want you to sleep. But the important takeaway here is that this requires like 100% subsidy, more or less. I mean, the reality is to build something like this, you cannot afford to build it without the lion's share of money coming from subsidy sources or, deferred loans of really favorable funding sources. So in this instance, this was, the HRA had to do this application. They did 2 years of application. They were denied the first year. This is very common with tax credit projects. They did it again the next year, had made some tweaks. Got really fortunate. This is in the state of Minnesota, they received the most money last year, and it was all bonding. And when Alyssa comes later from Minnesota Housing, if you really want to nerd out on the different ways that you can do this, I'm sure she'd oblige. But I'll just say this. You can see up here syndication, and without, again, getting too deep in the weeds, tax credit projects are I think, Carol, you're a champion. If they're easy for you, then I will outsource them to you, because they can be very complicated, but typically you have consultants helping to do the application itself, and then the syndication itself goes through a bank that syndicates tax credit. So the HRA itself doesn't deal with any of that because it's legal and very complicated. But the point is, it's a yearly application through the state. It's called the Minnesota Super RFP, and you can apply, and you'll get denied, and then you apply again, and you just keep trying. In Greater Minnesota, they're harder to do. Projects are harder to do in Greater Minnesota. I know I'm a little biased, but in part because the costs are just as high, and the incomes are lower. So when you're thinking about median incomes, so when you're trying to cash flow a project or show, even for one of these, you have to show that it's not going to be in the red, like consistently. Like you have to show that operationally, and you have enough subsidy to cover everything. But all of those things are based on the incomes of the area. And so for this, for example, it's 100%, it's 60% AMI. So the whole building is available to tenants making 60% of the median income of the area or less, which, you take 60% of $100,000 like in Rochester, that's very different than 60%, it's $60,000 included. But the costs are the same. So I'm just trying to really bolster your confidence here.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
When you did the tax credit, did you have to have so many set aside for homeless?
Yeah, to make it competitive, good question. To make it a competitive application, Minnesota Housing has a couple of sweet spots. One of them is permanent supportive units, and the other one is preservation. Those are two different types of projects. I mean, they are massively oversubscribed. Like it's probably 3 or 4 to 1.
4 to 1 at least.
Yeah. So, which means that there's no feasible way for them to fund all the things that come through their door, and so they try to provide feedback on what we can do better next year if somebody applies. But the reality is it's a math problem, and maybe the legislature will increase that. There's talk about increasing some tax credit, but we don't know yet. So you can. One other thing, start quick, is this is, when you're talking about rents at $700, which is really appealing, and they cost $270,000. You can see very quickly that this is very problematic. The other thing worth noting, and actually go to the next page, is that this is why I think a LIHTC project is probably not realistic for Cook County, at least yet. They have to be very sizable. To get funding, there are a few different buckets of Minnesota Housing. There's 4%, 9% bonding, 4% with bonding, so fun stuff. The point is, you really have to be above 40 units to get an award, and it's very costly to do less than that. There's kind of an equation for it. The other thing is, so you have to know that there's demand for all of that, and you have to have the support. You have to have somebody to facilitate and run the building, operate the building, and you need the support services. So when you try to do all of that in a rural county like this, it's really spread out. Where do you put it? How many can you absorb? How can you prove the need for that many units? It becomes challenging. So it's not to say, my intent here is not to say we should never explore a LIHTC project. My intent is to say it's a very complicated process that can produce wonderful units, but is it the right fit? Don't know yet. Off the cuff, I'd say we'd have to do some more digging for sure to see if it's worthwhile. And plus, we'd have to get researchers to pay consultants to help with it. So if you have any questions about that, we can certainly talk about it in a second. Can you go to the next one? Okay, if your brains are still on, sorry about all that. This one I think is maybe a more appropriate type. So I had this in the back of my head for a few years, actually before I was doing specifically housing. I've always loved pocket neighborhoods or small communities, in part because they achieve a couple things: new housing stock, and they create more of a community focus. Traditional neighborhood development's really difficult, and like new urbanism. So like when you think about a city block that has an alley going through, you don't see that happen very much anymore, and there's a reason for it. Cost is one of them. So the developments we see now, like single family, almost always are sort of roads put in. So think of the, what is it, Nordic Star development that One Roof did. You have houses on either side, there's no alleys for sure. And then you have a bit of cul-de-sac at the end, and there's a turn-on point. And
curvilinear.
yes, curvilinear, exactly. So you don't see the grids, and part of that, of course, is topography. You can work more with topography and do roads and infrastructure where there's not bedrock. Try to avoid the bedrock, probably impossible here. But this also allows for that. So this is a project that I kind of cooked up, and the HRA, when I took that role, they hadn't done any development for a while. And I said, what do you think about if we did it? And they said, sure, how would we do it? And so I got cooking and scheming. And the goal was to, this is 18 units, and this is a concept that I put together, to give us an idea. So we had to find the funds, hire a contractor to build the thing, and then offer the units at a price that made sense. One of the objectives here that I think is hard to do is to create a mixed income community. So usually with affordable housing projects, it's kind of an all or nothing. It's that has changed in recent years, but it's difficult to, from an investor perspective. It's sometimes hard to get equity for a mixed income project. But the goal here was to have the rents are between 50% and market. They're in that spectrum, and that was intentional because across the street there was already a low income HRA housing, and so we don't want to concentrate that, but we also want to make housing available. So. I'm very curious to see. I'm going to drive down in 2 years and it's done. See how it goes. You go next.
And so these were built on site, they're not prefab?
Oh yeah, I'll get to that in a second. Yep, thank you. So this first step was finding a site so that I could present a scheme to the HRA folks, my boss, and I found one, and the county owned it. It was a tax forfeit property, and so I partnered with the county to get that queued up, and then I acquired that on behalf of the HRA from the county at a nominal cost. Because the county had a policy where you could provide tax forfeit land at 20% of the EMB if it's for affordable housing. And so the longer I was there, the more I was taking advantage of that. It's just, the short thing an anecdote to keep in mind, the land cost doesn't make or break the deal. It helps. We learned that the hard way. I did a rebuild Duluth program that we designed and implemented a couple years ago. The free land helps. It might put them over the edge in trying to do it, but it doesn't make, as a percentage of larger projects, it's not going to make or break it, but it's a good helpful tool. And up here, where there's so little land as we've established, I was looking at the Land Explorer, and I think I identified all of the publicly owned land that isn't the Forest Service or DNRs, and the list is not long. And it took me one day and evening. I was like, okay. So the point is, we have some limited options that we could create it with what we have available. What's the scope? What can fit here, design-wise? Turned out 18 units was a good fit to leave enough community space. Also the topography of the site, there's this little kind of extreme running through it, which naturally bifurcated the site, which we did the 2 nodes for that reason. What was the budget? I developed the budget. It was about $4 million. It was about ballparking. I had to draft an RFP, issued an RFP to get interest from developers. My hope was to get a modular builder. Because I wanted to do a pilot. This was a pilot project anyway, but I wanted to do kind of a double pilot project. What if we did a bunch of modular in this pocket community? What does that look like? What are the costs? What can we say? So we did the RFP. I got 3 qualified responses. 2 of them were modular. The one we selected was stick built. I was surprised. The modular folks are booked till 2023 and 23, most of them. So it wasn't just a capacity issue. It was, yeah, we can build it, but they're in such demand that their prices, they were actually just slightly above the folks we selected that were stick built. So the cost saving wasn't, that's what we were really hoping for, is to find a new path forward in that regard. But we went with the one that made most sense. So We selected the developer, and then we finalized the budget. You can go to the next slide here.
Hey, Jason,
Yeah.
just for context on that map, was the property across the street, was that the one awarded the CRBPS design for the rebuild of the loop?
Yeah.
It was, okay.
Yeah, with Sean?
Yep.
Yep, this right here, 6 lots.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, and that was, I mean, they were looking at doing more market townhomes, which is another consideration for the mixed income. We didn't want to have, like, that would have been a nice balance with HRA mixed and then their townhome project.
And it really didn't take off because building prices were accelerating faster.
Continued,
than
yeah.
initial, okay.
They're still trying to, they haven't totally given up hope. What Chris is referring to is we did the free land program that I mentioned before. I did a lot of pilot stuff to see what works, because we have to. We have to get creative, and that's what I believe in here too. And we provided this for free to an entity to build 6 townhomes was their pitch. They were gonna do them on market, so one of the concerns they had was, can we sell them for what we would need to in this particular area of town to make it worthwhile? They ended up value engineering some of the building down, which made sense. They removed some of the attached garages, and they did some detached. They tried to figure it out. But now, that was in 2019 we issued it. Costs have gone up so much that they just can't make the math work. So, yeah. Yeah, move to the next one. So this is what they ended up, this is the design. Actually, they're gonna be a little taller. There's gonna be about another foot of headroom. But they're kind of small. They almost look like beach bungalows or something. We call them cottage homes because they are, between 600 and 750 square feet. So they're really like individual apartments that are new, that feel like and you'll see a picture of the, here's the layout. And very manageable. They're all electric heat, so we didn't have to run any sort of propane or natural gas. And because they were well insulated, the R values were 50 in the roof or something. That allows for less demand for utilities. So, and the goal is eventually to put a solar array there to help offset some of that, and they're looking into some grants to do that. But even per unit of these was $240,000 to $350,000, and these are 750 square feet. So, if you didn't know how challenging it is to build, welcome. It's very expensive, and the only way things like this. The reason I could justify the HRA doing it is because the private market wasn't doing it. There was a lot of talk about it. The city had rezoned or provided a new zoning tool, a special use permit actually, called a cottage home park, which allowed for this type of site design where the buildings aren't necessarily facing the street. And some neighbors had concerns about that. But it is allowed, and so people were interested, like, hey, conceptually that's really cool, we could do some interesting site design, we could maybe do more density, there were some allowances in there, but the private market couldn't quite figure out how to do it, or find a parcel big enough to make it make sense. And we'll have a similar challenge. Go to the next one. So for familiar with Duluth, you can kind of see the Spirit Mountains back here. So it's on the west, Duluth's the west end, which is different. And it's right below, there's actually a bike trail right behind it. The DWP trail system and the Munger Trail connect and go right behind it. So a path would go from here to, that was one of the selling points to doing it, is providing the residents very easy access to recreation. It is often the case that lower income and affordable housing projects don't have that, because that's more prime real estate, is to have that recreational amenities, so it was a great selling point. To be able to build it right there. And that's what the insides look like. There are more photos if you're interested. But that's what it ended up costing. And so it's $600,000 more than we wanted. And again, I mentioned the county provided the land. The HRA had $1 million still from Hope 6, which was several years ago, that federal program, and they had been kind of banking some of it to wait for projects. And so we did this. They put together an application for, it was weird, I was sitting in both worlds. This was my project, and I was also the one who did the ARPA. Anyway, it's strange. They put together an application for $1 million for ARPA, and the city approved it with 5 other projects. And then they are going to be bonding for the remainder. And so it was Elizabeth who mentioned bonding. That's one of the things the HRA could do. In our meeting our next board meeting, I'm going to be presenting a bond fees proposal. But we can issue bonds, conduit bond issuances, which basically we're a pass-through entity, that are municipal rates that are lower than market rate, and the HRA gets a bond fee. So when we can do it for the right project, it makes a lot of sense. And obviously we had to do it here, but the bond rate market is also going up because everything's going up. And today, the Fed just announced another 0.5% increase, so rates will, making it easy for us. We can go to the next one. I think that's it. Okay. Sorry, there was a lot. We're a little over time, so acknowledge that.
Well, it's really interesting. I don't know about you all, but I love hearing the case studies. It just kind of gets your mind going and all of that, and that's what we're hoping. And we are going to have some intentional time in a little bit after we do a break to kind of dive in. Is Jeff on the phone? Jeff Corey?
Jeff is on the phone, yep.
Excellent.
Oh, sorry you had to listen to me ramble, Jeff.
So we're really pleased, Jeff Corey from Woodruff Housing was able to join us, and he's got a presentation, and we got a little kind of panel discussion Carol will help facilitate. So Jeff, we got slides up and ready to go.
Okay, thanks. Your voice was cutting in and out a little bit, Elizabeth, so I'm going to assume that you said I should start the presentation.
Yes, please.
Yes, please start.
So Woodruff has done 2 projects, as you're probably all aware, in Cook County, in partnership with various funding partners from Cook County. The first one that I'll talk about is 4 Directions Dwellings. You can advance the slide to the next one if you like, please. I should say that my video feed is a little bit behind the telephone reality, so I'll just keep going and see what changes on the screen after a little bit. So there's about a 30-45 second lag from what I can tell. So anyways, 4 Directions Dwellings is a project that we developed in Lisbon, next to the Arrowhead Electric Cooperative on land purchased from the cooperative. We have 16 units in 4 buildings. The project was designed to be housing for the workforce of Cook County. That's why the funding was committed, and that was the aim of the project. We worked fairly extensively when we started in Cook County to do a project on the eastern side in Grand Marais, which I'll talk about a little bit, and on the western side, which is this one. We kind of pushed them forward on somewhat parallel tracks. But it consists of 8 one-bedroom and 8 two-bedroom apartments. This was modular construction, and the total development cost was close to $3.2 million. We did the bulk of this development in 2018 and 19, and it's been pretty much fully leased up since it's been finished. The next slide talks a bit about the sources. Apologies for my tabbing getting off between Duluth and Cook County. It looked a little tinier last night. But the sources for the project include a bond from Cook County, which functions basically as a first mortgage in the project. Infrastructure dollars from IRRB of about $558,000. Workforce housing grant from DEED. The workforce housing program is now administered by MHFA, and it's terribly underfunded for Greater Minnesota housing. It's kind of the easiest, best tool to create some rental housing in rural Minnesota, and it gets somewhere around the $2 to $3 million a year in funding annually. So that just kind of keep. Every time I talk to someone in Cook County, I make sure they know that they should keep pushing that topic. The Academic Development Authority of Cook County and Grand Marais kicked in about $215,000, and commissioners from that project, or from the EDA, were super helpful in strategy and relationship building and so forth as we put that project together. Local employers kicked in about $30,000. There was some donated lodging. Lloyd K. Johnson kicked in $40,000, and NeighborWorks America kicked in $75,000. think it's just important to know that despite all of that funding, the project did not come in quite on budget. We were dinged a fair bit with bedrock and just things costing more than we thought they would cost, and it was a push for us to finish. And we're proud of what we were able to do, but it was a slog for us to get through that project for sure. Next slide, please. So the other project that we did was Increment, the Nordic Star development, which consists of 10 community land trust homes. You can see pictures of 2 of them here and one happy buyer. Some really great personal stories of folks that moved in there. It's really been a game-changing thing for folks that were fortunate enough to be able to move in to the project. And I'm realizing that a couple of my slides got missed, so I'm gonna talk through those quick, but I have to pull up my own show so I know what I was saying. Just a second. Let's see, okay, Nordic Star, so the slides you're not seeing, but I'll talk through. 10 community land trust homes, they're about 1,000 square feet each. They were modular. 8 of them were from a company called Homeowners. We had some pretty challenging realities working with Homeowners and ended up doing the last 2 houses with Ideal Homes. Ideal is the contractor that does modular work. The Dynamic was the company that built the 2 Ideal homes that were the last 2 that were developed. They're about 1,000 square foot each, developed over the better part of 3+ years. One roof had in our previous incarnation as Northern Community Land Trust before our merger in 2012, we made 2 other attempts at building community land trust homes in Cook County. And I think that's just important to mention because if it was easy, somebody else would do it, right? And also, I think the reason we were able to go forward and garner resources for these 2 projects, and we didn't have success when we won with our first 2 attempts, was there's much more broad acceptance of the need for affordable housing now. It's just a very different landscape in Cook County. That's how I've experienced it compared to the other 2 times that we came up. There were lots of questions the previous 2 times from contractors or realtors or folks who kind of thought that well, how come you're here to do this? And now there's sort of pretty broad acceptance that it's just a dire need. So one other thing that I mentioned is that this particular project, we had proposed a mix of incomes, 115% area median income and 80% of area median income. And what we learned was that most of the projects, most of the homes, the demand for the homes was for folks at 80% and below median income. And there could be lots of particular social reasons for that. My personal theory is that folks that, are planning a life for themselves in Cook County aren't necessarily thinking that there is an affordable homeownership opportunity for them, or perhaps, so they've got a plan which includes 5 acres and maybe living in a garage for a while as they build the next piece of their house, or maybe a more adventurous, maybe pioneering attitude than you might find, say, in Duluth. But nonetheless, the median income that seems to be the target market, if we were going to do more homes up there, would be probably closer to 60 to 70% of area median income than above 80. And then the funding for this one was provided by several sources. Minnesota Housing was in for a little north of $500,000. The EDA, $180,000. IRRB $250,000 for infrastructure. Odyssey development in for $25,000, and I'm realizing I misspoke, and I think we had the EDA in for a total of $215,000. So that's kind of what I can tell you about the two projects that we've done. Happy to answer any questions if people have them.
Hi Jeff, this is Carol Burr. I wanted to ask a question. Because Grand Marais is real rural, what would you suggest they do to attract developers?
Well, so some of the challenges that we had were, of course, things like bedrock, but also things like we had to build a road to make this project work, right? And so, again, this isn't said with judgment. This is just an observation of how things in Cook County are different. So where the utilities were, and was a bit of a mystery once we actually got to the time of building. And so, you know, similarly, we bumped into bedrock, and while we had funding for infrastructure, it ended up not being enough. And so I think, like, you know, a way to sort of incentivize the developer would be to do all of that infrastructure on the front end with public resources and or private resources, and then sort of set the table for the developer to come in and do the housing piece. That would help.
Okay, thank you. And then Jeff, how has the Duluth HRA helped One Room? I mean, Jason, sorry.
Well, you can answer too, Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff, you can answer too.
Well, Jason will probably have more examples because he was the HRA guy who thought he was helping us more than he was.
That's a good question.
Because One Room does more of our work in Duluth than in Cook County, I'm a little crispy about Jason leaving town, and so pardon me if I take a couple shots at him. The HRA in Duluth has helped One Room with things like land acquisition, acquisition of tax corporate property. They have helped with certain funding. TIP districts, for example. You know, when I first started doing this work 24 years ago, TIP was a pretty dirty word in Duluth if you were a moderate to a lefty, and that doesn't leave a lot of other people in Duluth, as you may know. But there's lots more acceptance of using that tool lately, and the Housing Authority has helped with that. We've had specific partnerships with the Housing Authority to renovate single-family homes, to provide inspection services for us, providing rental assistance for making some of our tax credit applications more competitive. What am I missing, Jason?
Well, I think one thing that HRA provided access to things like CDBG dollars and managed the HUD funds that the city got, which obviously is not the case in Cook. So there's a scale issue there too, and just the resources that a city like Duluth has receives. And I think they get $3 million a year from HUD. I don't think Cook County gets any HUD funds. Do you? No. Okay. I didn't see it anywhere, so I probably would have found them. So that's one thing. The land, right before I left, and sorry that HR wasn't as helpful, Jeff. I appreciate that. I hope the city was more helpful. One of the things that we worked on a lot was identifying. I worked with some of Jeff's colleagues and staff people on identifying lots that the county owned that could be, again, taking advantage of that 20% EMD process for infill projects. and then, and specifically for community land trust homes. Because Hra is really the only analog here, being able to use existing city municipal infrastructure. Because one of the problems we have in a rural community like this is when you get outside of city limits, every time you need to install a septic system in a well, it's another $40,000 plus. So the ability to do, that's why there's a bit of like a, I would say the infill project or the small, like one at a time sorts of housing units in this community are either going to be ADUs, where there's existing infrastructure on somebody's property, or they're going to be in city limits that have infrastructure to make them affordable. Other than that, there are going to be things like One Roof Nordic Star that are a little larger in scale to help justify. I mean, that's on city infrastructure, but it's going to have to be a certain critical mass to justify the infrastructure in utilities, or investment in utilities rather. Otherwise, I don't think we helped you, Jeff.
A couple of other things. There have been some projects where HRA has covered, where we teamed up with them to preserve 150 unit apartment building.
Oh, yeah.
And in that project, there was the covering of some pre-development expenses because that was just sort of part of what we negotiated. So our particular housing authority had, more cash than the two nonprofits that teamed up to do that project. So, but that, that's a way to sort of minimize some of our risk as well on the front end, I think. And I think, the Hawk Ridge Estates development wherein we did, I think, a dozen or 13 land trust houses amidst a bunch of market rate ones. And that was a subdivision that the housing authority did all of the infrastructure for. And, we had buildable lots on which to construct homes, and the land was either free or dramatically reduced. So, a couple more examples in that space.
One other thing, just to note, you got me thinking about it, Jeff. One of the perks to an authority, and you covered this in the slides, I think it was about powers of the authority, to acquire property for blight reasons. One of the ways that can be leveraged is if the HRA owns the property and if they don't have to worry about property tax while they own it, that means holding costs for developers are lower. So while you're trying to queue up a project, if there's, let's say, a problem property, or there's a property that's got a couple of really tough condemned houses or whatever it is, like you could probably, everybody in our community, I say, can you think of any property that's, somebody's always going, oh yeah, I think, yeah. You can think of one or two. The ability of the HRA, if they have the funds, to acquire that for blight and redevelopment purposes, while it gets that property temporarily off the tax roll, the likelihood if it's really blighted, it wasn't contributing a lot to begin with. It queues up the ability for the HRA to either to develop or find a developer who doesn't have to take the leap and the risk of acquiring that property and then however long it takes to develop it. We can hold it and not have to pay the property taxes, and really it's just about making sure the property is maintained, if it's needs to be mowed or whatever the case is. And that has been a useful tool. I mean, I did that a lot more with the EDA, but the ability of the HRA to have an inventory, however small, of properties that then, can market or provide at whatever cost to a future developer, having that ready to set on the table is super helpful. Does that sound close?
Yeah, I mean, a great example is the two-module apartments in Duluth. One Roof did the legwork to acquire, I think, 7 or 8 different parcels, lined up a loan from Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, and the Housing Authority agreed to own the property in the interim. One Roof didn't have deep enough pockets to make that loan work, but the Housing Authority standing behind us did, and it was a relatively easy thing for them to do compared to how hard it was for us to acquire the property.
So Jason, can you tell us how you think local government can help projects happen?
Well, we'll talk about, there's lots of ways. I will keep it short. Some of the tools you mentioned, that you had up on this slide are definitely worth considering. And Jeff mentioned the dirty word of TIF. And 24 years ago, it was much worse. Even when I started at the city, it was sort of, we don't really want to talk about that. And I get why. And there's a very fine balance of figuring out what a project needs, and not overdoing that. So I've told, when I meet with developers, and they say, we're gonna need some assistance, I'm very frank with them. My job as a public employee is to figure out what do you actually need, what do you think you need, and back it up to what you really need to make it work. It's commensurate with, industry standards. So one thing that I've often had to communicate to the public is the developer has to make money. We want them to make money because then they'll do more development. Like, that's the thing we want. We just don't want to subsidize their profit above and beyond what is appropriate for the project. So there are some industry standards on returns, like how much you cash on cash, or what the metric is, cap rates. And you can look at that in like communities and figure out what's a reasonable rate. Because as you've seen by some of the numbers on the page here, the cost environment is incredible. There's a reason that the HRA exists and why this community decided to establish one, because the private market wasn't able to do it. So I think that some of the things that local government can do is, and some of this already happens, like Grand Hre has relooked at zoning, I understand, and made more accommodations for density throughout the city, and also allowed things like ADUs. That's a huge step. Cook County could look at some of those options too for zoning, and look at it being a little more inclusive with mixed use and density, and I think looking at simple changes. So just one off the top of my head, a simple one, like I think it's in Grand Hre, the zoning is 35 feet maximum height. If the spirit of that is to say we don't want anything above 3 stories, then say 3 stories. Because the project is 36 feet. And it won't get through because there's contention, of course, around view sheds, and I'm very familiar with that conversation. But what's the spirit? What are we trying to protect? And if there's an ability to change one little change that allows a 3-story project to happen, which means another level, let's just say, of housing, that's worth considering. So it's those things are things local governments could do alongside of inventory of housing, or I should say real estate, providing, if there's land that we have that's available, providing that at little or no cost. And then, of course, using the myriad of tools we talked about, from tax credit to TIF to bonding to applying for grants and things. If it's not clear, like the New Moon and Jeff's project, like it takes all of the things to make something like that happen. But there are ways to make it a less painful process so that people like Jeff and his organization want to come back and build more. And I think that's part of the role of the ADJOURNMENT and local government is to try to reduce those barriers so that they say, hey, it was really actually a pleasure to work in that community. Even if we didn't make a ton of money, it was really, the experience was a good experience.
How, for those projects that One Roof did in Cook County, how did they handle labor, housing, and getting the labor up here?
It was a big challenge, and I think, so thanks for the question. We tried to do too much of it ourselves for the capacity that we had at the time, and I think that's an example of sort of where I do think there's potential for the private sector to help out in some interesting partnerships, to help out with some of the project management potentially, and also the relationships. One of the things that we bumped into was we sort of had the choice between 2 excavators when we started in Grand Hre, and the first one bumped into some significant problems and it kind of disappeared on us, and the second one was really overwhelmed and not able to, step to, nearly so quickly as we might have. So that's not a small problem at all. And another silly example, seemingly, unless it's happening to you, is there were inspections that were required by the state to have happen to the single-family homes, and there's nobody north of the Twin Cities that did those inspections, and nobody that was willing to travel to Grand Hre to do the inspections. So some of those things about rural Minnesota are really challenging because the rules are sort of based on, cities that are built out or formalized with their procedures more like Duluth or Twin Cities or suburbs, and you start looking at a small town and it can be a vastly different environment in which to operate.
So if you brought your own crew up, you guys tried to do a lot of the work yourselves, where did you stay? How did you house yourselves at nighttime after you're done swinging hammers all day long?
Yeah, well, you saw there was some donated housing. I don't remember. I think it was Scott Harrison who sort of had offered some things up to help with that. But otherwise, yeah, it was just hotels and long days and yeah.
All right.
Any other questions? Because I think we're ready. Are you guys ready for a break? A little 10-15-minute break?
All right.
Thank you, Jeff, so much. Great information.
Is that, he's done, right? You're off the hook, Jeff?
Yep.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Let me know about Fridays. That'd be great.
Will do. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I hang this up or is
I don't know, do we have anybody
Any
else?
others? Are there commissioners?
Mr. O'Brien, are you on the call? I'm muted, so.
I did send him the information.
You said you might be a few minutes late, but I suspect you'll be able to. Well,
Let's just keep it open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope folks get up and stretch.
Yeah.
We have some interactive thing next, so we'll have to tune your brains back on and get thinking with us.
I have a question. The ability to levy a tax that HRA has is 0.085. The assessed value of the house multiplied by 0.00. Because, yeah, well, it's, so the 0.85 is less than 1.
Yes.
Or if you want to, how are you?
So it's 0.6, I multiplied it by 0.085 and come up with an enormous number. That doesn't work to me at all.
No, that's 8.5%.
Yeah. I just moved it over 2 decimal spots, yeah. Just had to double check my math, you know?
That's a good point though, because if people see that.
Yeah, I think it'd be better in parentheses to write it out, because at 0.085, that looks like a multiply. You know, it needs to be 0.000. Yes, right. It's just because it, I. Because it's not worth it. I mean, the whole thing, let's get some money in the house, so we can go, because everything we're gonna do is gonna cost. So let's get started.
We're gonna be doing it anyway.
Oh, it's gonna be $4,000 a year.
Oh, my cost would be $45.
That makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
So if it wasn't for you, if it was for $400. Well, and to be clear, actually, that's not property tax. So you multiply it by
That is so good. No,
it's not.
it works perfectly.
Levy would actually be.
And you know that county commissioners don't.
Otherwise, they got.
I know, it's so.
So-
We're the best Western.
Because I believe,
If you're,
I just,
so it's not,
I asked.
so you don't think of that as your house being using the levy is
And
actually
you're right, it's
existing tax.
Whatever the tax levy is, there would be an increase of that.
Yeah, which is gonna be, that's just small.
Right. That's because we just got. I got a call back, yes, I know, and I listened to it last night on the radio. He's very good, I mean, he's doing but. Oh, yeah. The assessment was a 66% increase. 66%. We lost 18.
It's just the way we do it, it's always on.
Well, that's what we're.
Yeah.
Homestead credits. So if you factor that in, it's a 73% increase. 73% increase.
It's just,
Oh,
no, that's right. There's no second.
Okay.
Right.
There's no.
Oh, I love
Oh, we get the homestead.
Who does?
Yeah, you could one or two of them.
Your question.
Because, so every year, it's
It's just kind of creepy.
so my suspicion.
A quid tile.
Yeah, exactly.
They did our quid tile a year or two ago, and this year the quid tile.
So yours is a blanket market.
Really glad.
Right, and the example is this property that sold, I don't know, for 6 months, a year ago, it sold for.
And I volunteered for
$50,000, and this sold in last January.
committee that will have, it'll be.
And my question on this is, in Michigan, I watched Sutton's Bay Area Detroit, just like Grand Rapids.
And.
Greatest little place in the world, right? And then the other thing that happened was that the federal government brought private property and state parks to create the Sleeping Bear National Lake Shore. And I know the guy that worked for the feds.
You're the lower.
And we're figuring
Yeah,
out
and
layers
the
of
little,
maps.
Yeah.
this area here, yeah, right. And what that did to
That'll
property
actually
values,
be
and I saw
piece that.
land speculators,
Yeah, on maps.
local business people,
The county website.
and then the second, third, fourth generation old folks on fixed incomes could live in one. Right, and so my thinking is that in this community, that we should be,
So really.
investment properties,
I have
not here the same mix as
Cranked up.
homestead residential properties. In other words, people that are buying houses to turn into
Or if we just
Airbnb,
took.
land speculators, and commercial properties. I mean, on commercial properties are separate.
Yeah, they are.
But right now, housing is housing, right? So that means it's going to rise in Airbnb, that's housing.
So the state until after the movement. So the state has to tax classification.
I got my commercial
So
gutter
that is actually a huge, like.
Right.
Housing is residential. There's also. Temperatures.
I agree that there's different definitions, just like this assessment is assessing all of the increase in sales, so the demand on all of these properties is going way up. So he's nesting all of that together in terms of how much my property jacked up because of the acre value. It's acre value. And I'm gonna ask him, where I am, show me what you show, my place up in Homeowners, show me the comps to my place. Yeah.
So I'm not, I haven't looked at his work page.
Right.
But I do know units. And I know the state requires, there's a certain thing that the state requires, assessors to look at it. He should, like your property value should be commensurate with, the comps that indicate. So if you're in East End, if whole place is having enough sales, then there's not a lot of it. So you have to actually.
Right.
And you can say like, hey, these two properties that are similar enough to yours, similar in, let's say, they're not on the lake.
Square footage.
Total, yeah, that don't count any adjustments for that, you have to.
Right.
This is how we get to that, they have to move it back.
Right.
And if they can't, then they, so you can take a local board of appeals, I would recommend you do that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and this, I was at this table arguing on the other side.
And I have never done this before. I've never had an issue paying my property taxes, never. And I don't have a hard time paying the tax money, but the evaluation, because that chunk that you said afterwards is just strictly building.
Well, and that's what I mean, here in the years, have jobs in other areas, payments and while they
Might have just been seasonal now.
In theory,
but that income.
Right, because it's based on, it's based on the levy. I got that.
So the reason why I mentioned that the classification is short-term rentals or multifamily. So if yours 4 units or above, you're in a different bracket.
Yeah.
And why that matters is because they have a higher tax rate, which means you're paying, like, if those get appropriately classified, the rest of the people that are homesteads and owners pay less tax. So that's part of the task with the county assessor to figure out how many units, how many units are in this facility or in this infrastructure.
Stories of some of them, yeah.
technically they own the street and investment property that's short-term rental if it's not new. This is where it gets really funky, because it's still a residential property. It's the use that's changed, it's not the property itself.
See, it becomes, the use becomes profit motivated. I mean, a homesteaded property is not profit motivated. But the Airbnbs are, land speculation is, those are all business activities.
Yep.
And those business activities, so it's driving up the homestead property values.
Yeah, but then the question is, how much is that house worth if you were to sell it?
Well,
That's what I mean, that's paper money.
That's all they have.
Because if, you know, if.
I wish you the best of luck.
Well, the problem is that the assessor is really well informed.
Yes,
He's really good. He's really good. I have a lot of respect for him.
That's great.
I'm just not happy with the
Well,
results.
exactly, people were like, I was thinking about selling, and now this is confirmed that I'm gonna sell, because the house is apparently worth 50% more than
Yeah. Well, the problem is everything else is you go to rebuy, so unless you buy $100,000 motorhome and one on the road. Yeah, right.
I sympathize, I certainly do.
Congratulations on your new job. It was like the last time I first met you, you had a brand new job.
Yeah, that means you've been with me for a while.
I remember seeing at one of the QAP info sessions we've done pre-lockdown, but,
Yeah,
I
that was,
just
February of
Very
2019.
contemporary look.
Yeah, I think
2020.
Can I steal you 1 second? Yeah. You can see this too, right? Because I have everybody up in their groups.
I don't
Okay,
know
cool.
if doing
Yeah.
some,
Yes, we should do that.
all for the pages and hardware,
Round two, and I'm like,
pricing and
I'll start
okay,
setting this
went
up
back.
here.
Yep, this is what I want, this is how many I need in one fund, the price will have worked.
Yeah.
Why, Jesus, wait a minute, you just told me the price was it. He does it every week. I did, I was like, I'm ready to say it's summer and.
Your summer
Even if it didn't feel like it outside.
We all saw a guy in shorts today.
I still have my winter jacket.
Yeah.
That should be everybody. So that's everybody.
I thought there's one, actually, of yourself, you have James, you have Beth.
So 3 groups of 3, great.
Yes.
Is that what-
Perfect, yeah. Because then, if you want, Alyssa, Carol, and I can float into those groups.
Sure, if you have any questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Drove you a message for Amanda, so. There's still people out for.
Yeah, there's still a few people out there.
Let's just take our time here. So do you want them to go to their small groups then lessons? Oh, okay, yeah.
I'm sure to tell Courtney you said hi.
Yes, definitely, tell them I said hi.
Yeah, let's see, you want to just introduce yourself, since everybody's just here, it's not very quiet.
My name is Alyssa Wetzelmore, I work for Minnesota Housing.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks for being here.
I'm so excited to be here.
We are excited you're here.
Yeah. Out and about, traveling around.
I didn't realize
so much I missed it, and so last week I was in Faribault and then Cato, and I forgot how much I like get life from seeing communities. So right. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, the whole working from home has been different.
I got used to it, but then once I forgot how lovely it is to be around people. Like, I didn't even
Enjoy
miss
it and
it.
get lonely.
Yeah. Can you reel it? Okay.
So James, how soon are we gonna look at, the group getting together to actually look at tax forfeited properties and identifying potential usage?
I need to circle back with everything on that. Yeah.
Because it seems like the sooner we can get going, at least that will give us some direction. So, I'm ready to go tomorrow if need be.
Yeah.
So,
And it sounds like Jason started some.
yeah. Well, I think all of us have, started to look, and it's just like putting our heads together, thinking about the size, and that's where his expertise of what can go on certain acreage is going to be really helpful. And then at some point, when we think we've identified what's appropriate, I think we should talk to a couple of contractors and say, subcontractors, is this feasible?
All right, I'm gonna kick us off for kind of our next phase here. Thanks to Jason, he helped us design kind of a little bit more some working sessions. And just so you know, there will be some method to this, and that we were thinking how this might help in some ways in preparing both for session. I know that Jason has some planning sessions and things like that coming up fairly soon, but also again kind of getting the juices going between the different tours and different folks. So we're going to ask you actually to kind of move into some groups, and then we'll tell you a little bit more. So we've got Chris, Alyssa, and James. If you want to raise your hands, you're going to be together in a group. And then we have Bill and Steve and Beth will be in a group. And then we have Stacy, Ann, and Jason will be in a group. So there's just 3 groups.
Did I hear Lawrence in this?
Lawrence.
Sorry.
Well, I've been an independent employed person all my life, so it's just right,
You're a free agent, Lawrence.
Right. What do you want, which group?
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter to me either.
To the center.
Okay. Group 2, why not?
And who's that?
Group 2.
Bill, Steve, and Beth.
Okay.
Perfect. So if folks want to move together, then we'll kind of give you some supplies.
I'm gone.
Moving into the
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Sorry about my show.
How are you
Is that maybe like this order?
Well, I'm working on the EDA, business owner here in the community. Number 4 is my husband, K. Johnson Foundation.
Well, you're getting to say.
What business?
I'm part of the capital vacation rooms.
Oh, yeah.
Let's do it.
Right. So,
Lawrence, would you be willing to switch? We have 2 commissioners.
Oh.
all right, so we're
Yeah, that doesn't
making
give
some
a very
last
broad range of
adjustments.
You want me to keep the
Wait,
commissioners out of trouble? Was that what you're saying?
That's what we're saying. We don't want to work. We'll get in trouble with public meetings. We know that stuff.
All right.
Thank you.
And where you're?
Whatever.
All right.
You get to be with the boss.
Actually, the other way around. I can
All right.
Okay, so here's our first exercise together, and you can talk amongst yourself, but the first exercise is really something you're going to do yourself. and then it'll kind of feed into our next two exercises. So I don't know if anybody's ever done this 3-2-1 exercise or some version of it. It's a common exercise to kind of start the juices flowing after you've heard a lot of information, like just happened today. And so we purposely gave you kind of big, thick pens so you don't write super small or put a million things on one. But if you could write kind of one thought each on one of your pieces of paper there, those Post-its. So the ideas that you're going to share, ideas that were sparked, things needed for the HRA to be successful, and questions that you still have. So, and then we are going to collect those and we'll kind of organize them a little bit. And this will feed into our next exercise. So we're not going to do this forever. It's just kind of quick, what's in your head, ideas, things that HRA needs to be successful, questions that you have. Try to put one thought each on a Post-it so that then we're able to organize them, collect them from you. We'll just do this for about 5 minutes, maybe 5-6 minutes. Question?
Just logistics. We have one of these and we can put like 3 different ideas on one.
I prefer you put one idea on
one idea from ideas sparked on one.
Yep.
One idea is from number 2 on another one.
You can have more than one idea sparked. I'm just asking you put each individual thought on a piece of paper so that we can organize them afterwards.
And we're doing all 3 right now?
Yes.
3, 2, 1, okay.
Yes, yes. And in the end, you might not have 3 ideas sparked. You might have 3 questions and 1 idea, and that's okay.
Okay. All right, I started the timer.
Here until I have to go move my kids.
Yeah.
So when they text me, then I have to.
Okay.
We could keep it a little longer than that.
So that's the marker. So one thing I thought about right away is modular ideas.
We're gonna save them till.
Right before? Okay.
Yeah, we don't give them
I thought the idea about zoning adjustments that need
Is that
So we have ideas first.
You want to make it more complicated.
Right.
Is that flexibility. But I'm not saying
Well, we need some outreach to the people that's got the money. I mean, if you look at the 10 different sources of funds for some of those counties,
Always a wild card.
Homeowners income is one. Homeland finance is another. Jason knows these because he's been dealing with it all the time. But you just really need to start that outreach because somehow, to be honest, with a budget of $135,000, we aren't going to get very far. We just relying on that. We need to get some additional goal.
Do you have any other ideas?
You know,
Barb,
find it
that
like
you
scribble,
wanna add
makes
that?
up my poor spelling.
Are you trying to give us the
So-
handwriting
I'll check on my
challenge?
computer.
What's that? Are you trying to give us the handwriting challenge?
Standards or codes, bill codes.
Always scribbling, so let's make sure this one.
I could tell stories, but we don't have time for stories.
There's a plumbing inspector for commercial, and there's an electrical inspector for commercial and residential. But there are no others.
Nothing else. And we're not gonna be able to qualify for money unless we have that.
The kind of CDs, number 2 as well, are these ideas or are these things we needed with zoning adjustments? It's more of just an idea that seems
I think
not
that's an idea.
necessary outreach. I think that would be a necessary thing, 102
Yep.
Yeah.
outreach.
I think I think for something needed to be successful, the HRA is going to need some sort of quick win, just that's kind of enables to tell the story, raise one.
Oh, I'm kind of excited.
You're right. Whatever successful project can happen, I think.
I'm hoping that everybody has a signature. Just grant one.
Access to tax work for their land.
Okay, good.
So this is your 1 minute warning, and then we'll wrap up this exercise.
Mitigate risk of somebody else, I mean, owning the property,
We already,
yeah, those kind of.
we just have, we've got a committee to look at it and to figure it out. But we haven't started.
Create a process.
And we need to do it. Well, we right now can identify those properties very easily, but it's about how the criteria we set up should be done.
Yeah.
But that's gonna be better to hear.
Questions I still have. She gave us some time.
Just have a decision.
Yeah.
It's on my list for next week. So, on other business, it's just covered.
I thought the money was not fair.
Oh,
On all the
yes.
projects, I mean, it's just, I've built a number of things in one time here, and it's always hard, it's exponentially harder. So
Typically, you should
fines are so things, even if you have the money, it's a problem.
All right, so we are going to move on. I know there may be more things, more ideas in your head, but we only have so much time together, so we're trying to figure out how we kind of have some discussion that leads one into the other. So the next thing that we're going to do is, this is an intentional group exercise. Has anybody done mind mapping before or used that as a construct for thinking? So some people have, some people haven't. It is designed to be an exercise, like you can Google mind map and like a million things will come up that show you kind of some structure for doing this. But it is designed to be something that is kind of left brain and right brain, where you are truly just brainstorming around a key concept or a question. And so the key concept that we have here is build more housing. So that's what Jason told us. He is identifying as a core objective. Clearly that's pretty broad, but still there could be more. And so then we have some little lines here that are really just prompts. There could be other ways your brain goes, where you're kind of thinking, what now starts to happen? And with the other people in your group, you're thinking, what are ideas that feed along, some road that will lead to build more housing. So these are prompts, these little lines where we have resources, partners, some other things that hopefully you can read. But that is not to restrict you. You can really do anything you want. And so we're going to pass these. You can write right on here. That is kind of the most helpful. And then we'll have one more group exercise, and we'll do some recording now too.
So you put these ideas on there?
Yes, and so we will also collect your Post-its, because while you're doing that work, we're going to take your Post-its and try to start organizing them if we can, so we can see what are some commonalities or some organization from those Post-its.
Oh, no, we're not.
So you'll
Do it on the table here?
yeah, you want to do it on the
I don't know if I
table.
remember my ideas.
So sorry, you're going to shuffle a little bit, and I know these are skinny tables, so you might want to move it as you are thinking of things, but again, the idea is just, this is truly just a brainstorm exercise.
All right.
Okay? It's got, sorry, it's got a sticky here, so you can pick it up, put it where you want.
Everybody,
Sorry.
Apartments.
All right, so kind of put it like this. So in the center is build more housing, resources, what kind,
City property
okay,
right down
where,
there on Highway
partners,
61.
and for whom. Right on here.
And I should have said, just so you can pace yourselves, we'll kind of take in that 10 to
As
15 minute
sells
range.
that property.
We'll kind of see, we'll be able to tone folks
I
in
already told him,
Okay?
he's done. He's fired.
Gotta call cousin Guido.
So-
Yeah.
Yeah, so, where I was thinking Grand Prairie.
Where was it?
So that's the city municipal lot. Used to be town. Can we have more than one person writing or one person?
We get a person writing on
That's
it.
aware that James, I would say
Isn't that what they
proximity
put
to.
the building back there? And I thought
Yep.
Yeah, plus it's, it makes it a little more challenging.
I'd like to put throughout the county.
Yeah, commercial, they're gonna put that anyway.
Anyway, they should put it on wheels, so they just move it around. Okay. Apartments, one apartments, for whom?
For,
I'd like to do something senior.
Anything else for where?
I want it for, like, my kids' age.
Young families.
Young singles.
I'd like to see it actually
Not
so
so
that there are
house to say I
eventually some smaller projects, clusters in shorter
My son is no longer
clusters,
living here.
in hope that it's not just all focused on
Jumping
Grand.
around the housing.
Well, that's what his mother is.
I know, I don't know why
But
you
they're-
didn't do
Yeah, it's so
it.
strange.
But my daughter is not living with me because there's no place else.
So what type and kind?
So that would make her technically homeless.
I
That's the definition.
I saw that.
I found that in census.
I think there's,
For sale, low to medium.
It's multi-generational, means people with multi-generational.
yeah, it comes out to be 10. Yeah, I did it.
One of the goals I get all the time is people looking for pet-friendly housing.
Oh, yeah. The percentage of people that have pets
That's
is
just
really
because of the
huge.
legacy question. Right. Safety reasons.
Sorry, it's so beautiful up here, I'm like.
So, young,
Young singles.
Oh, sure. Workforce.
No, that was really interesting. I didn't know anything about that at all. Yeah, and like getting support of, vendors on board.
Either one of these.
Yeah, it's fine, it's just
Interesting and
It's a disability.
even a yourself.
really administrative.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe that's enough.
Yeah.
So-
I also
Do we need
think
families?
about
Family help?
type and kind. We did for whom as what type.
Say that again. Medium
So,
That's because of retirement.
so really, this is for whom.
Statewide, actually.
Yeah, senior over there.
Yeah. So. We didn't follow the-
Well, there's a, well, no, that would be three.
Yeah,
A lot more people that are.
Apartment, so
Younger generations
apartments.
over kids later on, I don't know, that's a lot more of that. A lot more people that left during the recession that until recently go up, that goes back to second year.
Townhomes, row houses.
Parents are roommates, and then suddenly the economy started to turn, people are affording one place. So there's a little, that's skewed the numbers for sure.
Tiny houses.
Okay, we have some, nice to meet you guys.
All right, see you next week on Tuesday.
Yep, I'll be there.
Great.
Up until recently, the Russian studios, it's only 82, it was like
Yep.
400 square feet. Now it's
Accessory
2011.
or granny.
So all of those shifts, all of the same.
That's what I need, a granny
Space
flat.
right now.
All right.
So, do we need, single family homes?
Yes.
Yes, I think so. That
So
would be
that's
another
housing,
way.
Township.
Because I think families prefer.
Yeah, by and large.
How about
But then
businesses?
even, so the courtyard.
Yeah, developers.
City, I
Yeah.
think courtyard
Yeah.
was more like for the seniors, for maybe young families to be together.
single-family homes, but it is in for the density to get it.
So kind of like. Yeah.
Close in.
So senior
Resource.
age is the only thing in which fair housing industry.
Oh, money.
Lottery.
So you can restrict housing.
All right, so TIF, it's also land, land is pretty, I see,
Campus.
and it's land, and tax ordinance.
So I've heard sometimes that churches that have property and
Right, so some
that
of them
reminds,
don't
yeah.
want
TIF, taxing
old people home.
and tax abatement.
So mixed communities too, as far as age is concerned, so we did have seniors.
County government, we turn this one over into
There's
part of the
So like homestead.
Yeah.
And waiting list.
Long waiting list.
Yes.
What's the number of people waiting for it?
Yeah.
So that is another Yeah.
They didn't seem to like the idea of
There's Silver Bay is doing this development project with the idea of getting seniors out of the smaller start homes that is built for affordable housing. And then that goes up. And I've heard several folks, I've been asking people, I've been folks with affordable housing, several folks have said the same thing. My mother.
I would say a resource is
If the local space for it, then that housing is.
that understand the challenges of building. That is one thing I've heard from builders
One of the
that come
challenges is
elsewhere
when you're doing.
to build here, they're kind of shocked by the rock. They're shocked by the cost, you know.
They're shocked by the cost of septic, because of the rock.
So unless there's a way to find.
Fortunately, there's so few
Subsidize
homes
that,
that
to make
are
it easier to build.
they're having trouble getting it. At least they know.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Well, there is a density, I mean, it makes it more dense, especially since land use is not that much land
I
to build
think
on.
about,
So the courtyard, the co-op situation, that the homestead is not.
why didn't we forget that?
But it's funding is a problem.
Yeah, so it's just interesting if you,
They're gonna, the GMA shows, they're gonna sort of
just those two. Exactly, you just said. One of the goals,
Yeah.
to address those needs is to live in.
Infrastructure like the water.
That's how they, what they're doing.
Well, they don't have anyone
Yeah.
to go to, it's a product that's coming. And so the question is, so at what age do people want change? So if you're selling your.
Yeah.
You're selling your, it's there for a couple of years.
They're partners, you know, it's the school district,
Yeah.
It's very.
it's North Shore Health.
Maybe that's a standard infrastructure project. So.
So
there's-
just-
Can you guys wrap up the minutes, or
It's kind of in between space, there's less maintenance, it's.
Mixed age.
GNR.
Can you guys wrap up the minutes here?
US Forest
So
Service.
search-
I mean, you got three talkers over here, what are you talking about?
Not actually Grand Portage.
Translate what's in here, there.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I didn't, you want to add here?
Was the housing built in Grand Portage, those homes?
No, it's supposed to be the Park Service.
Luton and Grand Prairie.
Okay, so it wasn't a, it was stick built,
Put your name.
not modular.
Yeah.
And then,
Because I read about,
I would just say,
I'm not talking about like.
employers, again, sometimes
apartments
it's in
that
their
were
saying.
modular.
And this is for the apartments, yeah,
Star Tribune, it was about a big residence in St. Paul. And it was modular, there's actually all these interesting things given that
They're gonna put up the arrow.
kind of the idea that Alchemy had, what they can do with their little,
Electricity and broadband all the way up to Lake
To
Park.
the state.
It's really interesting space.
It is 100. So that's what we're gonna have a lot of development,
How long
but
it
it's
would
a
take to
commute.
get a month.
So my guess is.
well,
You know, they're 2 years out.
I looked into that, I remember, you know, we were talking in the car when I was there.
Yeah.
And
Because you're putting job centers
for
are also.
860 square feet,
Yeah.
I rented that place out, and I had to know it's not gonna
What is the,
happen.
the band usually, they were the largest employer in the county.
All right, so folks, wrap up your conversations. We're about to turn to our last exercise. Looks like you might be ready anyway.
Just so you know, we circled these down here.
Oh, but it was good discussion.
Resources.
So the next exercise is going, it's actually called an asset mapping or asset wheel. And what you need to do, because all communities have assets, you're gonna take your Post-its and put down who your individual assets are. Who your economic, community, cultural, and everything else. So what you wanna do is identify those assets in your community, and this really helps. This will help Jason in the long run, because you'll know where to go. Okay? Does that make sense? Do you have any questions? Has anyone ever done this before?
No.
Okay. It's new, I just learned how to do it myself, and I presented it at NCDI. Like, some of your assets would be, your economic would be, you have grocery store in the community. You have businesses in the community, different things like that. Cultural would be, do you have, every year do you hold some sort of fair or have like?
Fisherman's picnic.
Yes, stuff like that. These are assets that are actually going to draw people to your community also. So, right?
What is the yellow one?
The yellow one on this one was economic.
Economic, okay.
Yeah.
You're all taking one of those two.
Oh, okay.
I'll give each of you one and.
I love these big sticky post-its.
You just gave us example of this, you know, from the.
Yesterday I said tomorrow. One of our guests looked and said, that's mean.
Well, individual assets too might be
These are all
just,
resources.
there's people that are
Yeah, so the
creative,
idea, like,
that are
coordinating
patient, that are
between
flexible,
community assets from what the agency
you know, what they're saying before, that people live above a garage or in a garage for a year or two, and you don't find that in a lot of places. There's more that pioneer or self-reliant, that's a really, or independent. That helps us.
Community, would that be like Karen Black?
They're asking for one single person, hire a person.
Helps develop.
HRA.
You know, if there's training,
Yeah.
education.
So,
To
yeah,
be your police department.
so let's see, economic.
Well, economic, we have jobs.
Housing.
The issue isn't that we don't have
As it
jobs,
relates to
we
housing.
don't have people to fill them.
Well,
Like for instance, if you were gonna do a, homeless park, you have to be security and police monitor. And you wanna think about when you build it, that there's not traffic flowing over it. So like I did with cul-de-sac, and a lot of developments will do towards one way in, and so that people are. That's an asset.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Having police to help.
Well, I
I
just think it's-
think it's economic,
Especially if they can like drive through.
you know,
Check.
Check.
okay. So,
this would be,
so that would be, police first.
Yeah, I should put that, have it intended for
jobs,
Yeah.
writing it.
That's pretty good, Ann.
I don't know if I can do an S. You can do the S, sure.
Economic,
Right.
for sure. Also,
Fish pick, yeah.
Rendezvous days.
so I think it, market appeal.
August. What's
So I
this
know that
year?
gets a lot of be helpful.
August.
About that.
I know they just announced the date. and I
So
forgot.
real estate market appeal.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's good.
All right,
I mean, and even cultural, I don't know if it's economic.
I would look.
Cultural is nice, yeah. There's
Yeah.
incredible local country.
I would say also,
So I think that's.
That's cultural, yeah.
Is
Lifestyle,
history.
lifestyle.
Yeah,
deep
okay.
And I think our.
reverence for history.
Oh, yeah.
For sure.
Community resources for me,
Yeah,
it's
it's
really nonprofit organization.
Yes.
Maybe in communities, could be, some of these are double dipping or something, right? But like.
Higher ed is a big community resource.
Yeah.
Assets.
Yep.
Trail systems and that brings in tourism and also quality of life.
What was it you said? Trail line? Outdoor
I can do
recreation.
why. Yay!
Good word.
How about Gunflint Trail?
Media Memorial and WTIP is
Well, we got resorts too.
Community as a.
community
WTIP.
dialogue or, you know, informed.
Yeah.
Maybe not always correctly, but at least.
Yeah. That gives imagination. That's why social media is
Gunflint
not.
Trail.
I'm gonna put North House Old School on.
Yeah, that would be another one.
Boundary Waters.
Yeah, absolutely. And
It's kind of everything.
Put that up.
you just think of assets now in computer land.
Yeah, that's true.
What are things?
What about the harbor?
Wilderness. I was
The
get the W. I know it's there, but I'm old fashioned.
Safe harbor.
I knew it is the B.
What would that be?
Well, it's kind of everything else, because it's also complex.
Yeah, just put it on here. Safe harbor.
Hubert Humphrey would not like it. He was my buddy. I wrote letters to him, and then the Boundary Waters. Interesting.
Restaurant.
So like continue to maintain that or?
Well, there's somewhat.
Restaurants, yeah.
Far out there, maybe, everything else, but should we get Canada? Kind of a gateway to Canada to some degree.
When I look at movies tomorrow, I'll make sure there's amenities, instead of being love growing up way out in the sticks.
And to think about it.
I visit my niece and nephew in the cities, they say, what do you want to eat? I said, carry out. Anything carry out. There is no carry out. Well, Bowman, there's no delivery, there's no carry out. Anything carry out.
Yeah, we do. That's the most important thing. That's why we're all here.
Oh, but when I was growing up, it was a big thing for us to fill in for pizza at Apollo's. Because nobody else had pizza.
It's all relative, right?
Oh, do anyone dare put down vacation? Don't say
Well, I think, you have to, it's certainly part of the economic driver.
Well, do we have lodging on here, all in Cook County, all the lodging and stuff that?
Is that a tourism or do you think that? I mean, could.
No, I think tourism, yeah. I think that's probably there, yeah.
I'd say specifically like
They're getting really good at this now.
I'm not good at guesses.
I
I
think
gotta
it is,
ask you.
yeah. Yeah, and that would be
Thank you.
economic?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's economic.
We should put a big notch over there.
We
We do need that.
Yeah,
We just have
Lutzen,
to-
is that L-U-T?
Well,
S-E-N?
Get a
Z
balance.
in there.
I mean, they're here in the business,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
I think that's just the massage place that sells it that way.
Oh, it's really. I get it, Zen.
Oh, Zen.
And we've seen a huge increase
What's the other
in the
one?
last couple of
Lutzen,
years,
what's the other
partly because of COVID.
The
People
Boundary
coming here,
Waters
more
or
and more
something?
people coming.
And what's the other one that they just got, dark
Is
sky,
that
dark?
going to continue in the future at the same
What's that?
pace?
We got designated one of three in North America.
It's more of a market.
It's called Dark Skies. Is that it?
The village
And the Boundary Waters.
convert more
Dark
of
skies.
the old.
They got,
At
they
some
officially
point,
designate.
some of them might.
Well, I wondered that, like, I looked at the numbers, the number of houses sold last year, the properties sold in Colony were 600. That's 10%
Agricultural is also
of all the housing stock
Yeah, I heard that.
in 1 year.
Well,
And
Is there?
what percentage of that are people thinking vacation
Well, I don't
on?
know.
Yeah,
Is
it
it-
was,
is it
it's
economic?
for the truck.
Because people have been having staycations.
Before the border
they
patrol,
stay
people come down,
They go to
spend time at the casino, then they come to Grand Rapids.
So we're an endemic
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
a pandemic, will that switch and will people suddenly wanna
yeah,
head out?
I see.
So,
Oh,
really change.
Up to 40.
A resource in their website.
How about the, speaking of it, how about the new development group that's raising some money to invest?
Well, Steve's part.
Is that right?
Put
Yeah.
money real estate fund.
Right,
Is that right?
that's what,
I think we can put that on actually under.
Yes.
oh, yeah.
Oh, that's
I
a
think the
good.
Canadian market just so we don't.
Oh, yeah.
Went into a couple of them with the clock shops.
So then we'll turn to Alyssa.
Okay.
Great expectations, church.
All right, one last minute to wrap up, and then we're going to turn to Alyssa.
Okay. What buildings someplace on here? Is that an economic driver?
Probably, yeah, I guess you could.
Because some of these, so many of them actually
Is
are
it-
challenges in addition to being.
Well, and,
resources.
yeah, what's your
Yeah.
assets?
Yeah, well, yeah,
Is
but I mean,
that an
it's-
asset to
Could be
our
like
community
yours.
that we don't have enough, or?
Seems like a detriment.
That's right, well, all right, everything else. We do have buildings, yeah, yeah. Where would you put that? Down here?
Not anything in there, let's put it.
Yeah, there you go.
So
All
Steve's
right,
not
so-
what I'm like, no,
Let's
no.
call it, let's
keep
declare
positive.
victory.
Call it.
Let's declare victory.
Researching something specific to be helpful.
Oh, security, oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Big asset.
yeah, big.
So Carol and I will collect what you've done. In a perfect world, we'd also kind of reflect out and kind of talk as a group, but we only have so much time together. So we're going to cover everything so that we can turn to Alyssa. And she's got some presentation, and we'll see how much time is left after that. We hope we do some Q&A too. A lot of good questions for the state. And,
guys.
yeah. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, start that.
Yeah, let's start off on that note.
So do you just want me to signal?
Good.
Yeah. Oh, I'm good.
It was a familiar crowd.
Well, I think all of us are here.
I think that was yours, does that look right? Or was yours a state bank?
No, mine was, it was this one.
All right.
Thanks.
55604. I'm probably the last person that's ready to answer that.
Oh, that's, I think code in reverse.
Is it 406?
I thought it was,
Dyslexic or something?
well, I thought I was making it up because it's two.
I think it's.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Alyssa. I'm Community Development Director at Minnesota Housing, and if you can't tell, I'm really excited to be here. I love this, my job involves lots of things. It's relationship building, it's listening to community so we can do better for all of you and make the things I'll be talking about work better for you. And also, connecting with resources. So this makes me so happy, and when I talk to my coworker that lives in Duluth, he's like, well, of course you're excited, you get to go to Grand Marais. It's like, one of the most beautiful parts of the state. So I just wanted to share, just a sincere joy it gives me to be with all of you today, and just really wanting to be a good partner. Of course, I didn't mean to be creepy, but I was definitely taking notes, so who are the employers again, and who are all of our assets, because I think understanding the local pieces helps us know, okay, well, if we're designing something, right, how are we making sure it could be useful here, but it's also really cool to see how some of the themes that are similar could be solved at a state level. So I just wanted to start by saying how happy I am, how much I appreciate the invitation, and also just, I've kind of designed this as sort of an agency resources 101. I know, obviously, Jason, you have this. I mean, you'll probably stop me, but at least just so it sounded like just kind of getting a good foundation, but just want to emphasize how much not only me, but my coworkers really do enjoy speaking with all of you, so don't be shy. We want to help hear what's going on and help you with these projects. So if you want to change the slide. So just a little bit about Minnesota Housing itself. We call it Minnesota Housing, it's the state's finance agency. And so, there's
pieces of the puzzle that we do, that other agencies do as well. So, you know, we're here because we care about housing. We know how fundamental it is. It impacts everyone in all corners of the state, and again, it's part of what it means to have a thriving community. You know, I have a PowerPoint, but I'm sorry, if you want to switch, sorry, if you want to go to the next slide. You can go to the next slide.
No.
This is way too fancy of a presentation, I think. Except for that part. So we're an independent agency started in 1971. So we're kind of this quasi part of the state, but we also have our own board. We have our own independent audit and ratings. We don't get, none of the state's funds go to fund our staff. And then relatively speaking, the appropriations we do get from the state are relatively low. We do about $1 billion in single-family lending, and we use those funds to fund a number of the programs that we have. So I'm focusing more on, you know, what you're thinking about for resources from a development perspective, but I'm happy if you have questions about specific homeowner or renter resources to get into that as well. You can, next slide, please. Yeah, our comms team put this part together, and I'm usually like more low-fi here. Next slide. You can go through all of them. Sorry about that. So, oh, sorry, just go back one. So I think what's helpful, as I mentioned, you know, when I think about the slice of the housing piece that we talk about as an agency is really that housing stability. So, you know, Department of Human Services is looking at homelessness, response shelters. We're really looking at that permanent type housing. So that's the funding that we do. So from homelessness prevention, supportive housing, so if you need services to stay in your home, right, due to either maybe a mental health issue, a chemical dependency issue, you know, if you can get that support and you can keep your housing, I mean, that's great for everyone. We certainly fund rental housing, then of course home ownership. And I would also put in there manufactured housing. That's another kind of unique housing opportunity. And then next slide, please. And again, just flip through all the fancy to get to the main point here. So one thing, you know, I'll talk a little bit about an upcoming direct to homeowner program we'll be launching that's federally funded, but a lot of our work is really through our partners. So, you know, a lot of our lending resources are because we have participating banks. Various services that we support, such as homeownership education and things like that, are through other organizations. So we're not, I guess we're too Minnesotan to put our stamp on all these things, but I think sometimes people don't, you know, we're out and funding this work, but it doesn't always have the stamp of Minnesota Housing on it. And then of course, Minnesotans, right? So who we are as a state. You know, I think it's interesting. I heard a lot of conversation about how over time, which once was a lot of hesitancy about housing development and what that might mean for community change, to where so many communities are seeing that everyone, as our commissioner says, everyone wants housing that they can afford. It doesn't matter what your income is. And so, you know, really seeing how much these housing needs are pervasive throughout the state, and also a lot of the similar themes around the types of housing and types of challenges that communities are experiencing. So I just wanted to touch a bit on legislative priorities. So there's continues to be growing, we know there's the need for housing, and there continues to be larger and larger ask at the legislature to fund housing. So I won't necessarily get into the weeds of all of these different funding sources, but you know, I think I gave lots of handouts. So the legislative priorities are really about making more investments or resources available to develop the housing that communities need. So that's just high level. And again, just emphasizing we're a very small part of the state's budget. If you know, and now's the time if you'd like more investment in housing to contact your legislators. I don't think I need to go through this. We know it's been really challenging. But I did want to move to the, honestly, it's probably easier if I could just re-talk. So, like I said, my coworker that lives in Duluth, I'm like, hey, I'm going up to Cook County. Do you have any data that you could share with me? He said, well, let me, like within a day, he pulled together all of this data. So I won't get in the weeds, but I do think if we have time, you know, I'm a big, like, there's numbers and then there's humans, and how does that help us understand the story? So I'll have a question for you if there's time. So the median household income is $67,255 for homeowners and a little under $39,000, little over $39,000 for renters. You have a very high homeownership rate, which you probably already know, about 77% overall, with about 82% of white households being homeowners and about 45% of Black, Indigenous, and households of color being homeowners. You also notice, right, 58% of your housing units are vacant as a result of short-term rentals or second homes, and this has increased 5% since 2016.
Say that again, please, what number is that?
So 58% of the housing units in Cook County are vacant at some given time. So either because they're short-term rentals or second homes. So not 100% of the time, but this has gone up 5% since 2016. And then finally, the residential sale price in fiscal year 21 was nearly $300,000, which, as we know, with skyrocketing housing prices, has increased significantly, so 41% since 2016 and 12% since 2020. And I'll work with Elizabeth and Carol to get you a PDF of this if you'd like to reference later.
Can I say a quick clear? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, please, yeah.
Just to be clear, because I know this is a topic the community is really interested and concerned about, short-term rentals and how the impact of all that. The statistic that Lawrence asked about, 58.5%, that is of all housing unit types and stock, right? So
Yeah.
Okay, so that's not just single-family dwellings. That's the condos, the townhomes, the resorts that build single-family units. Essentially, because that could be interpreted very differently. If you're like, all over half of the homes, single-family homes, or that's not the case.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Say that again?
So in other words, the short version is the housing units that they're counting are inclusive of things like sea villas at Lutzen. So
The system has detected that a minimum number of lines are connected to this conference.
Sorry.
Sorry about that.
Siri, is that you?
Yeah, right. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
there are housing units that were built for the explicit purpose of short-term rentals,
Right.
like resorts and so on. That's inclusive of all housing units.
Got it. Okay.
Jason, just because it could get lost, or I side past you
Yeah.
with making that information accurate, excluding those units that skew those statistics, because that would be more helpful.
For just single-family homes.
Yeah.
But if those units are privately owned but managed by the resort,
Mm-hmm.
they could be used for your own living, couldn't they not? Some have covenants, no, some do. If you could live in them year-round,
Sure, they could be long-term
they
housing,
should be
yeah.
part of that
Well,
number.
maybe not if zoning doesn't allow it. So if they're a commercial specific zone, and it's a multifamily, then maybe you can't have condos or townhomes, I don't know. But I think that's probably the exception, not the rule. But I just wanted to clarify that we don't get the wrong image that 60% of all single-family homes are empty more than half the year.
I think the point is, though, for me, is that 58% of habitable, livable dwellings
Yeah.
are vacant.
Yeah, that's significant
That's what
enough. I
I'm
just want to
saying.
make sure that was, we understood that that was the
Yeah.
point, not all.
Whether it's single family or whether it's condo on the beach, in terms of being vacant.
What about hotel rooms, or essentially, I mean, Lutzen Resort has a big hotel building, and it has the sea villas, and it has the Poplar River condos, and the condos clear, and sea villas and all that, I guess, that they would be counted in here, but how about the units that are effectively a hotel in the main
I
lodge?
doubt those would be counted as housing units, but I don't know the methodology that was used, so.
I'm
To
not
put you on the spot.
I was gonna say, I'm not the data person. Cody said you were a data person, so thank you for helping me. My son, if they don't have a kitchen, they wouldn't be counted, I'm sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But more to learn there for sure,
Yes,
so
yes,
there's no big
yes,
into.
Yeah.
Which I think is one of the great things about this work, right, is that we're to kind of hone in on information to help your decisions. If you don't mind, you can skip forward to this. So if there's time, I'm curious, you know, there's numbers and then there's experience. Like, is there any story behind the data that would be helpful for me to know, or that, you know, you wanted to just share as part of the group's conversation?
Alyssa, did you have, because this is the
It
last
looks
slide.
like I might have not captured all your slides, so.
Oh, that's okay. You know, feel free
Yeah.
to either turn that off or just leave it on the front side. Because again, I mean, I prepared this because I didn't know what to expect for the piece, but I think this is more fun if we can be not slide focused. So yeah, I mean, you know, I shared some numbers, or if you wanted to go to the, I'm sorry.
There's no more slides.
James, if you wanted to go just to the data slide, I'm curious if there's a kind of the story behind the numbers that you thought the group should be discussing or considering.
I don't know that he had the data slide up there.
Yeah, I don't think the data slide was
I
up.
got cut off
Yeah.
before that,
Okay,
unfortunately.
well,
Yeah, this, the pandemic slide is the last one.
oh, that's,
Can you
Sorry.
forward that to him,
yeah,
if you want him to pull it?
I'm not logged in as a meeting.
you know, that's fine. So I would say,
Maybe after the meeting, it will.
well, how about this? If the median household income for homeowners is 67,000 and we're looking at an average sale price of 300,000, like, you know, how are these pieces of data feeling for your community?
That raises the question I raised earlier, the $67,000 median income. How do you determine that? Is because we have Hoagland, or we have Tofty, or we have Grand Marais. There's a wide gap of where those people live. Is this community? Is this?
It's for the county, Cook County. So that's another good place to dig in.
So 67,000, and you're building out in West End, okay, you might be able to maybe get it. You want to build on the East End, that's probably not likely. Well, except now that, like we were saying, the pandemic has changed some things.
The math, I think, works as far as, so if you're looking countywide, again, the median is the one that's in the middle, like, right?
Yep.
The math, until maybe today, we'll see what interest rates do for mortgages. So let's pretend we're talking about this yesterday, which is crazy that that can happen so quickly. But if the median income for household, which, by the way, should be based on the median household size, which is probably like 2.1 people. I don't know what Cody did, so.
Sorry, you're so much beyond my.
Well, I'm affirming one thing, and that is that the 67,000, give or take, the median can afford up to about a $300,000 house. So that, like, so in Duluth, the median income was 54,000, and the median household price was like $250,000 mortgage they did for. So it's close. So the median's somewhat aligned, but Chris can tell you, try building a bunch of houses for under $300,000 that meet a whole variety of needs. There's a pretty small number of designs that you can build for that much money. I mean, and I'm buying one of them. They're under that threshold, so it's a good, you know, the thing that's needed. But it's anyway. I'm
So I
sorry.
think one question I had is, what does above that median line look like, and what does below that median line look like? Because then what's affordable to folks below that median line, or is that median line pushed up because you have some people with quite high incomes?
Absolutely.
And so, again, it's just a median. So
It seems to
there's,
me like, in terms of developing the county, when we do a county-wide thing, it's not granular enough to help us know. You know, if you look at the soil types, there's certain areas that you're not gonna build on because there's rock there, versus wetlands, you're not gonna build there. So you have to get down to for building sites, you gotta get granular. And it seems to me like when it comes to the economic development, we need to get granular, because the east end and the west end are very different, and shoreline and inland is very different. So really, we need to, in order to make the dollars work, so to speak, it's gonna have to be a lot more granular than countywide median numbers. That doesn't really help us when it comes down to actually putting a paper to the pencil, a pencil to paper.
And I mean, statistics are tough because are there outliers, the unemployed or underemployed, that are skewing that, or some really high earners that are skewing that, and should maybe the outliers be set aside?
Do you remember the figure for renters that you gave 67,000?
Oh, for renters,
39.
a little over 39,000.
And that's not terribly surprising. the disparity, I mean, just.
Right.
Which is, again, as a not super data person, why I wanted to ask the story behind the numbers, because I think it does help, right? Like, who are you building for? What's their income? What's the soil or not? What's the bedrock? So those are all good questions. I wanted to run through a few of our programs. I don't want to get into the weeds to the point that it's boring. Again, you know these, Jason, so this is not necessarily.
I need to look, please.
Okay.
There's more to learn.
So first I wanted to highlight, very, relatively soon, we're going to be launching the Home Help MN program. So that's the federally funded homeowner assistance program. So we know that the need for that program is going to greatly surpass the funding that's available. And so now we're really in what we call a get ready phase. So if you know homeowners that are struggling, there's a few, again, I think we can follow up. There's a bunch of different handouts and things, but now is really the time to get ready. And so eligible applicants live in their own home, have some financial hardship due to the pandemic. Again, this is defined very broadly. They have past due housing expenses on or after January 21st of 2020, and an income equal or less than 100% of the area median income. So according to their chart, that's around $90,000 for households of 5 or less. So it's a pretty generous, sounds like many homeowners would be eligible from that perspective. It will allow up to $35,000 in housing assistance, so basically to shore up your past due expenses. It's pretty flexible, so mortgage, contract for deed, property taxes, homeowner and condo association fees, manufactured home loans or lot rent, and homeowners insurance. Yes.
Are these grants or loans?
These are grants.
Okay.
And these are, you have to be past due, right? So this is
Correct.
effectively the rent help MN version for homeowners.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, with some differences, of course, but the same federal funding, just for a different purpose.
Got it.
Is there a way that you've heard that communities are doing any sort of work to pre-identify who might potentially be eligible, say like if they have late water bills or other things that might be indicators of need? I'm just curious, and if they're...
Yeah, that's a great idea. We do have a very small grant program that we're using, where just to really reach, I'd say communities that are significantly behind kind of disproportionately. There's a really broad network of homeowner counselors and foreclosure prevention counselors that have separately received funds that are kind of overlapping this work. So I think those are some ways, but I think that's a great idea, Elizabeth, to kind of, if proactively, or, thinking about the various like CAP agencies or other types of agencies that communities may turn to in times when times are tough. That's a good way. And we, have a huge media campaign and things like that, but that's why I wanted to highlight it, because sometimes you'll know best kind of how to reach those homeowners that might be struggling. So website's pretty easy, homehelpmn.org. Again, homehelpmn.org. We have get ready checklist prepared, so it just lists all the documents you would need. Again, now is really the time to work and get those documents ready to go, so when the applications are open, then you can go ahead and do that. We do have a call center up and running as well to answer questions. So again, I'll make sure to follow up so you can have this information, but because the timing, it's getting pretty close, I think we've either picked a date or this close to picking a date, and it's in May, so just wanted to flag that.
Who's the applicant in that case?
It would be the homeowner.
So I think contacting the banks like Grammar State Bank, is that
Yep.
right? Yeah, that would be the fastest way to, because then they can make them aware of the program so that they can reach out to folks if
Or
they're having.
maybe a media release, we could have Todd Ford do a media release.
And we'll have one too.
So we could forward that and through local channels.
Yeah.
And say this is, but they would know the folks locally if they have loans on things, they could say, hey,
Yep.
this is a resource. That's
Or
what-
maybe people who haven't paid their property tax.
Yeah.
That's another good one, yeah.
And the electrical.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so, and again, the payment would be made to whoever the past due balance is owed, but thank you. I mean, these are great ideas. I'll bring them back. I'm sure there's a core team that's probably thinking of all these things, but I think, the more we can really get everyone on this, getting the word out is really important. So then I wanted to talk through some of our regular kind of bread and butter programs that I think meet the types of development you're looking to do. I think from just some background I learned, it sounds like you're kind of getting your feet wet in the various types of funding, so I'm not gonna go into the weeds about our multifamily funds, but that is a really good option for larger development, you know, rental development projects, higher density. The single family impact fund, that is due Thursday, July 14th at noon. So that fund provides a range of single family development, including owner occupied up to 4 units. So I do like to highlight that use because we've been finding that communities are really intrigued by that idea. It allows for a lot of, also the economic development side of the coin. So that can be used to build new construction. You can use to demolish and remove existing structures, and then you can rebuild. You can use these funds to acquire land or properties for rehab, and then also for resale of existing houses. So like if the HRA wanted to purchase some number of houses, rehab them so the homeowner didn't have to, they could resell them, but then also later we have a number of homeowner assistance, so down payment assistance, other types of like fix up, more rehab if they needed that. It can also be used for construction financing and gap financing, and from my understanding, that use is not as well recognized by those that regularly use this fund. And then again, this also, lenders may apply for this to then provide those funds to homeowners. So I was going to look up in the area what some of those might be. So again, this is where we really encourage you to reach out. I have the email address in the presentation. So it's a nameless email address because there's staff turnover, but there's real people that want to help on the other side of it. So it doesn't go into the void. There's a really good system for identifying questions. So if you have a project in mind, it's really great to reach out and say, hey, this is what we're thinking of doing. They can help you think through how to make it more competitive, or if there's other ways to layer the funds. So just wanted to flag that is available. And again, per Jeff Corey's point, right, this isn't a moneymaker, right? There's often gaps between what it costs to build a house and what you can sell it for. So this can really help keep those affordable rates.
Just to be clear on that, just a quick question, the application for that. It is project specific, right? It's not so the application has to be in concert with the specific use, not for potential use.
That's correct.
Okay.
I did note in 2017, Grand Marais received, maybe this is what Jeff was talking about, a 7-unit new construction in 2017. And then I was going to talk a bit about the workforce housing development program. That's a really great fit. We've been finding, congratulations, you got the 22 award for 6 units, $648,000. So that's really exciting, and I'm glad that the timing is so that we can celebrate that together. It was established by the legislature to give funds for the direct development of market rate residential properties to increase the availability of rental housing. So I've heard at least that this is one of the easier grant programs or loan programs to be using. It's 0% forgivable after 3 years. So again, I think congratulations. Sounds like you know Sarah Bunn, or at least some of you do. My coworker, she's great, always ready and happy to talk to you about how to set up your application. It's still a very new use at the agency, so we'll be evaluating different things as the grant goes, including total development costs and things like that. This, for the 22, we'll have a 2022 RFP if the legislature approves additional funding. So the governor's request is $10 million for fiscal year 2023 and $16 million to cover fiscal years 24 and 25. So again, if you are interested and would like to advocate, now is a really good time to just let your legislator know how important this funding is for you, especially if you said, hey, we got it. So I think that's the thing too, is you want to know it's reaching your communities.
We've definitely done that.
Oh, that's awesome. And then I'll briefly touch on, just looking at time, there is the Public Housing Rehabilitation Program. In 2017, my coworker Danny let me know that you received an award for the Homestead and Pioneer project. I'm not sure how many publicly owned properties you have, but for those HUD properties, they haven't allotted the maintenance costs that are needed, and so the state of Minnesota has different rehab costs so that those can stay affordable. I just visited one in LeSueur last week. They had rusting off railings, and they were able to, have like really nice, safe railings, do some cement work and things. So just wanted to flag if there are any other properties that need some work, that this is a really important source of capital improvements. Looking at the time, I'm going to skip over the multifamily development today. I'm happy to join you probably virtually next time, or actually connect one of my expert colleagues in that division to talk through that very complicated program. But that's where you get the significant millions of dollars. And again, you know what that, you could talk about that much better than I could. And then just general tips for competitiveness. Local contributions far and away really help make a project more competitive. So, from, I think you mentioned land. So contributing land, contributing funding, the county contributing, again, some combination of land or financing or something to the project, and also local employers. We've been finding, more and more employers are willing to chip in some money because, again, they see that mutual self-interest, right? We need workers, the workers need housing. I know in Perham, actually, the business associations for 10 plus years have gotten their funding together to build a project every single year. And it's that dual purpose of housing. I think they probably have some share of the profits. I don't know all the details, but there's some really innovative partnerships that I think are exciting that are starting to happen, I think, in communities. Again, there's several handouts that I shared that I know we can follow up with, but wanted to flag the DEED Small Cities program can be a really helpful source of funds for low and moderate income persons. You can eliminate slum-like conditions, which I know the city of Duluth could use those funds. So that might be another way to kind of round out the funding sources. And then USDA Rural Development has some really good loan programs, both for the purchase of housing and the rehab of housing. So I listed a contact there for the single-family housing programs. Their housing repair, you can get $20,000 for a fixed interest rate of 1%. So, they have some really good terms on their financing programs. So, with that, I think I'm at time, but just really want to emphasize, I'm here for questions. I, don't always have all the answers, but again, there's so many of us all of us at the agency really want to be here for you, from the data to the specific technical assistance. So please do reach out. So I'll turn it back to.
Yes, one more question.
Yeah.
I didn't see other hands up, I hate to. But when you talked about those employer contributions, I was curious if you had kind of in mind or could share with us, like, what the range of that, because I've heard of, a variety of contributions around, and I guess it's all in perspective what is big or not, but I've seen contributions that are in that 5 to 10 range that, again, depending on the business, that can be significant, but to others that may feel like, we can make that happen, and then if that really helps to get a project over the line, that could be a really big deal. Just understanding more about that could be helpful.
Yeah, I don't have data on, there isn't a pointing category.
Right, I know that, just to kind of understand what are these contributions looking like.
Yeah, I think it really ranges. From my understanding, I think some of the areas where there's meat packing plants and things, like they may have contributed around $100,000. So it really is a wide range of contributions. But to your point, I don't want to discourage, right? If a business is willing to chip in $5,000, that can add up to some big impact in the community. Or even, this is getting a little off topic, sorry, but even, there's been things where like a church would sponsor one unit in a housing development project, right? So they would make sure that one unit, they would cover whatever that cost would be. So there's a lot of creative ways to do that. And again, my colleagues at Minnesota Housing are really, I think, really helpful with some of those brainstorming and creative ways to get different types of funding. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very appreciative.
Absolutely.
I think, Jason, you're going to close us out.
Yeah, so it's that went quick, actually, at least for me. Wow, we're done. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again for making it. I know it's a really tough drive from Duluth here. It's just terrible. No, but we really appreciate making the trip. And if you need an excuse in the fall, sometime to come up, we can plan a meeting. If you need to see the leaves. I mean, talk about it.
Let me know.
Yeah, well, but thank you sincerely. We plan on for sure looking at programs municipal housing has, and you have already been a valued part of this community is what I'm learning, and I hope that continues. And thank you, Minnesota Housing Partnerships, for helping put this on and getting this group together. I know that I'm kind of crashing the party. This is all planned before I came here, so.
I feel the same way.
So from my perspective, next week the ADJOURNMENT board has a meeting on Wednesday to do a little workshopping and talk about our work plan. My hope and our hope after this was to maybe inform some of that conversation with some of the information we had today. I hope it's clear that there are paths forward, but they're not a straight line to get housing done. So I hope that one of the things that I've learned has been reinforced, and I hope that you're taking away is that if where there's a will, there's a way. There's going to be a lot of will needed, but we can get creative, and there are resources to help make kind of a patchwork quilt to get the housing we need in the community. So if there are any last minute questions, I'm going to just leave a minute for that. If anything is just tickling your brain that you wanted to ask anybody.
I think the more data that you have, we could get would be helpful, because a lot of our housing problems, you can talk and it's speculation of what it's all about, but the data isn't always as available as there's to be. If you're a source of it, we'd love to get it.
So to that point, the EDA's housing assessment is coming out by the end of the month, so that's going to be informative. Just a quick comment on data, I'm glad you brought that up. It's only as useful as the inputs, and it's very difficult. Like median data, for example, we've had that conversation, is really helpful for larger communities because there's so many people that you're bound to help some of them. Obviously with a county like Cook County, where it's 5,600 people, census, right? That was the census number. That is a little trickier, but gathering data in a community this size is also very difficult. You don't have the systems. There isn't, for example, let's say the administrative staff or the systems already in place the bigger cities and communities have to gather that data. There's not as much filtering happening. So with that said, as much as we can get that to inform decisions, I think that's fantastic. And like she said, I'm a data person myself, so I want to try to quantify it. But what I think is true, and what I guess we can talk about even more as time goes on, is that the need is apparent across the board. It's the question isn't what we need, it's how much of each that we need. I think we could build anything as a community and it would be absorbed and used and needed. It's just how many of each bucket do we build and what's most in dire need, if that makes sense.
You get down to a matter of priority.
Right.
Really. I mean,
it's
a limited need, it's not but there are limited resources. And time, and people available to work on.
Right, what's the biggest need?
Yeah.
And how do you, even that can be a question we can answer, but then the follow-up is always, well, what's the funding available to fill that need? And sometimes the funding, it redetermines or recategorizes priority. So anyway, I'm sure we'll have a lot more conversations about that, but thank you for taking the time on a Wednesday. When you could have been outside in the sun. I'm sorry.
Carol, Elizabeth, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right.
I just love that that's the slide that keeps taking up.
The one you were like, yeah, we were going to talk about this.
But
But now I'm for sure I know it's because I read it.
it feels like PowerPoint.